So my work is basically all about syntax, which is the way that we put words together to create meanings. And most people who do the kind of work that I do on syntax are really interested in the ways that languages vary when they do this. So, in English, you say, you put the verb and then you put the object. In Japanese, you put the object and the verb. In Russian, actually, you can put the object quite far away from the verb quite often. So languages vary in different kinds of ways. And people like me, syntacticians, we're interested in what the system is that humans have that does this variation, right? So what is similar between an English speaker, a Russian speaker, a Chinese speaker, a Nungabuyu speaker in how we build sentences out of the basic bits and pieces we have. And the answers that people have given to that, and the answer that I believe is true, is that what is really similar is that we human beings have a capacity to take discrete units, like words or sounds, and we put them together in hierarchical ways. We put them together in chunks, and those chunks are put together in larger chunks, and those larger chunks are put together in larger chunks. And we do this in a sort of unbounded fashion. That is, we can just continue doing this, following the rules of our particular language, which is what makes our languages so creative. It's what enables me to say the sentences I'm saying just now. So this is a very important part of language: the discrete, the hierarchical, and the unbounded, the unending. And that's what most of my work's about. And that's what most people who do what I do work on. But actually there's more to language than this. So that is a fundamental aspect of the nature of language. But actually when people think about language, they think about more than just this aspect of it. There's something else. There's the way we use language, what we use language to do. We don't use language just to say literal things. We don't just, say, I am sitting on a chair. That would be pretty boring, right? What we do is we use language to express ourselves, we use it to express our thoughts, we use it to express how we're feeling, we use it to express what kind of a person we are. And that, I think, is another aspect of the nature of language that quite often gets lost from the perspective of people like me, who are focused very much on the theory of what human language really is, as far as syntax and grammar and things like that go. So I want to tell you a little bit about some work that I did with my colleagues at Queen Mary, which was about how the variation in language and the sense of self of particular individuals who speak language end up feeding into the kinds of grammatical rules that we have in a language. So this is work that has been done here in London, where we are right now, looking at the new kind of a language that emerges in teenage speak in certain areas of inner London. So if you go to somewhere like Hackney, Dalston, one of these areas of London, it's massively multilingual. So there's 100, and I'll probably forget the number, but there's hundreds of languages spoken in the borough of Hackney. And that means that through many immigrant populations, and that means that the children of these various speakers, they don't have a language which is effectively in common with each other, right? Because what they're doing is they're learning from their parents, whatever their home language is, plus some kind of second language version of English, right? So when they come to speak to other people, they're speaking quite differently from each other, right? So you've got some people whose parents might be from Turkey and who speak a sort of Turkish influenced version of English. You might have some people whose parents speak Haitian Creole and have a Creole variety. Some speakers who might have some like Chinese and so on. So many different languages. So there's a question then. So what happens when you take all of these kids and you put them together? What kind of a language emerges? Is it just a hodgepodge? Is it just a mess? Or is it structured like all the other languages we know are structured into, particular grammatical rules? So you'll not be surprised probably that it's the latter. So the case I want to tell you about is something that my colleague Jenny Cheshire noticed when she was looking at the data of teenage speakers from Hackney. So what the team did was they collected loads and loads and loads of data and then analysed it statistically. And one of the things that Jenny was looking at is what's called a relative clause. This is where I come in as a syntactician. So a relative clause is when you take a noun, like the cat, and then you add a clause after it. So you say the cat that I love, or the dog that jumped on me. So you've got these extra little bits, right? So the dog that jumped on me, that's the relative clause. So relative clauses in English, when they modify a noun which is human, so let's take something like the man or the woman, you say the woman who I saw, you can say the woman who I saw. You can also say the woman that I saw, you can say who or that, and you can also say the woman I saw. So 3 different ways of doing relative clauses, and they're all completely normal in day-to-day English, and everyone uses them in conversationally, just at a random in a kind of random collection of ways, when you have a human noun that you're talking about. So what Jenny noticed when she looked at this was that in the teenage speech of the children from Hackney, is that actually they were using it differently than speakers of other varieties of English do. As I said, those 3 kinds of relative clause introduction, who, that, and nothing, are not really, they're not really grammatically organized in standard varieties of English. There's some prescriptive norms. If you've got human, you should use a who. So second language speakers of English often get told that, but it's just not true. That's not what people do. People use that and they use who. So in standard English, you use all of them. But what Jenny noticed with or what our team noticed with the Hackney teenagers is that they began to use who when the noun, the person that the noun referred to, right? You've got a noun, refers to a person, when that person was an ongoing topic of the conversation, right? So if you imagine someone who's really important, or you're talking about someone who's really important to you, and you say, oh, that man I met at the party, or that man who I met at the party, and then you continue talking about him. He was this guy that turned up late and no one talked to him, and then when I saw him the next day, he gets talked about a lot. He's an ongoing topic, okay? Or you can imagine someone isn't an ongoing topic, right? Oh, those people in the bus, they were really upset when the bus blew up and something terrible happened and everyone ran away and da-da-da. But you don't talk about the people again, you're talking about something else. What Jenny noticed was that these Hackney teenagers were structuring the 2 kinds of relative clause in a completely different way than normal English. So they were using who when the noun was a topic of the ongoing discourse. So you can count the number of times that noun is referred back to, and the more it's referred back to, the more likely it is that the person used who in their relative clause. Now it turns out it's even more interesting than this. So that's a new rule. It's not, no one taught the kids this, right? It's a new rule that they kind of worked out themselves, okay? Where did it come from? So that's a really interesting question. Now it turns out that in these various languages that are spoken by the kids that are not English, many languages have ways of expressing topicality. So, Japanese does, for example, it uses a particular particle. Creoles do, they have a particular way of changing the verb. But there's various kinds of ways that languages mark that something's a topic. English doesn't do that, right? Except for these Hackney kids. So what seems to have happened is that what these kids have done is it's like there's this floating feature around. It's like grammatical concept of topic that other languages are using, and it's not being used in English. And the kids, because they're not getting full input in English, they're getting second language English, what they're doing when they're talking to each other is reorganizing the way they're speaking and taking advantage of this kind of floating feature that's around, okay? And so they use that to organize their own grammar. And it turns out that it's even more specific than this. So the more multilingual and multi-ethnic you are, right? If you've got tons and tons of friends who all speak second languages, right? Then you're much more likely to use this grammatical rule, this new grammatical rule, than if you've got mainly, monolingual friends. So it really turns out to be the case that, it's in a sense an expression of your identity as a Hackney teenager, completely subconscious. You don't know you're doing this, right? But it expresses who you are when you start using this grammatical rule like that. So that's really interesting, I think, because what it shows is the emergence of a new rule, and that new rule emerges through social factors, right? It emerges through the ways that people interact with each other, the ways that they want to be close to each other, and it's done completely unconsciously. They don't know they're doing this. You can see it in the data if you look, right? You can see in the data that this new rule has appeared, but they don't know they're doing this. And that's how all language works, right? When I'm putting these sentences together right now, I don't know what rules I'm using to put them together. I just put them together and they work, and I'm not conscious of the rules. I can make myself conscious, and because I'm a linguist, I probably do know a lot of those rules, but people can speak perfectly well without knowing them. And what's happening in this group of Hackney teenagers is they've innovated, they've added a new rule into their system, and that is as much part of the nature of language, right? This creation of new grammatical rules from social factors as the very nature of the rules themselves.
The history of child language acquisition goes back to the 50s. There's a famous debate between Skinner, who had a kind of behaviourist account of how children learn language, which was then famously challenged by Chomsky, who argued that you can't learn language just by listening to the language that you hear. There must be some kind of system already in your head, which is kind of processing that language that comes in a specific way to allow you to build a grammar from the kind of very small and fragmentary amounts of language that you hear. And in one way or another, this debate between Chomsky or Chomsky and supporters who think that you have to have some innate knowledge of language, some language that you're born with, and various opponents who think that language can indeed be learned just from what you hear, that debate has never really gone away and has continued right up until the present day. So the Chomskyan idea is that children are born with some knowledge of language already in their heads. So obviously that knowledge has to be very abstract, because the innate knowledge doesn't know what language the child is going to be born speaking. So obviously it would be useless to be born with individual words of English or Russian or whatever, because obviously it would be no use if you were learning the wrong language. So it has to be very abstract. So the idea, for example, is that children are born with, say, grammatical categories like empty boxes. So they're born knowing that languages contain nouns and verbs, and all they have to do is hear the language around them, and once they recognise words that they hear as a noun or a verb, say, then they can put them in the right box, as it were. And this helps the child because they're born not just with the boxes, but with rules for combining these boxes or these categories into sentences. So one rule that a child is born with, for example, is that you can combine a noun and a verb to simplify somewhat, to make a very simple sentence. So like, John ran or Bill danced. So the idea is that you don't even need to learn to do that. You're born with the categories and the rules for combining them into sentences. You have to learn which order they come in your particular language, but the idea that you can combine a noun phrase and a verb phrase in that way, the idea under Chomskyan approach is that you don't have to learn that, you're born with it. So the other approach says that you're not born with this knowledge of language. Everything that you know about language is just built from the language that you hear all around you. Difficult to tell between them, because obviously we can't look directly in children's heads and see what's there. So the way I try to answer this question is by running experiments with children. So I'll just talk about one example of where the two approaches make different predictions. So questions in English, when children ask questions, this an area that's been studied quite a lot, because children make quite a few errors with questions. So in English, questions should be something like, what do you like? Or what can she eat? But English-speaking children often make mistakes where they say things like, what she can eat, or what you do like. So a way to compare between the two approaches is to see if there's any patterning to these errors. So according to the Chomskyan approach, these questions are formed by one of these rules that I mentioned earlier, these rules that you're born with. So if you can make a question with one WH word on one person, say, then you should be able to do it for everyone. You shouldn't be showing different performance for different ones. Whereas the other approach, the constructivist approach, says that you learn language from what you hear around you. So this predicts that children might be very good at asking a question like, what are you doing, that they've heard an awful lot, or any question like, what is thing process. Whereas a question that they haven't asked very much, like, I don't know, why isn't he doing something, or why don't they do this, they'll be much worse with those types of questions. So the Chomskyan approach predicts equal performance with all the different types of questions. The anti-Chomskyan approach, or the constructivist approach, predicts better performance with the question types that you hear more frequently. And at least in my studies, that's what we seem to find. Children are very good at questions that they've heard a lot, like what's that, and much higher error rates 50% or higher for some of the question types that they hear more rarely. So that's just one example, and basically what I do in my studies is just kind of do this over and over again for different sentence types. So for questions, for passive sentences, and also for inflectional morphology. So the morphemes, the little markers that go on the ends of words. So like in English you have play, plays, played, or in Russian igrat, igrаю, igrayesh, igrayecie, and so on. So again, the Chomskyan approach would say, once you've learnt the verb and you've learnt the morpheme, it's a rule that puts them together. You should be equally good with all verbs and all morphemes, whereas the constructivist approach says, no, you start by learning the whole word form, and you should be very good with word forms that you've heard frequently and bad with ones that you've heard much less frequently. A difficult thing about the universal grammar debate is that it means lots of different things to different people, or even lots of different things to the same people at different points in time. So sometimes when people mean universal grammar, they are talking about the things I mentioned before, these very specific things like categories that you're born with and rules for combining them to make sentences. But sometimes people use universal grammar to mean just the ability to learn language. So if you present these arguments to Chomsky and say, the findings of studies like mine, and say this means there's no universal grammar, he says, no, that's ridiculous. Universal grammar is what means that a human child can learn language and my cat can't learn language. So by definition, a child has universal grammar. So at that level, of course, we can all agree with the idea of universal grammar. The debate over whether there's universal grammar is whether we're born with these kind of very specific categories and rules. So whether there can be any conciliation between the two approaches depends on exactly what you mean by universal grammar. If we're talking about very general things like a bias to be interested in sounds, to be interested in other people and what they seem to be trying to convey, or whatever Chomsky means when he says whatever it is that allows humans to learn language and not cats or trees, then of course we can all agree with universal grammar. But I can't see any conciliation between approaches that posit that you are born with abstract knowledge of categories or that you aren't. This seems kind of a black and white. Yeah, cross-linguistic studies are a very interesting way of trying to choose between these two approaches, but again it's difficult to do because you get, the findings can be interpreted either way. So I'm running studies that are at the moment that are looking at causation, the language of causation across 5 different languages. So we're doing English, Hebrew, Quiche, Japanese and Hindi. And I'm finding there's some real similarities across these different languages in the way causativization works. So English, and I think this works the same pretty much in Russian as well. So English has basically 2 different ways of talking about causatives. One is just a kind of a straightforward causative like, I don't know, the man broke the plate. So the causation is just already there in a kind of straightforward subject, verb, object sentence. But we've also got this second type of causation where you have to add the verb make. So you can't say the joke laughed the man, you have to say the joke made the man laugh. And what's interesting is, I don't want to say all languages, but a lot of languages, and all of the languages that I'm studying in this project, show a very similar pattern. They differ hugely into how they do this, but all of these languages have these 2 different types of ways of marking cause. And we've got the same 60 actions or the same 60 verbs across all these different languages, and we're looking to see if there are any similarities between the languages in which verbs prefer the make type causative and which prefer the other type causative. And what we're finding is there are real similarities here. So you can use the performance of English speakers to predict the performance of Hebrew speakers or Quiché Mayan speakers, because there's so much similarity across the two languages. So there's different ways you can interpret that. So if you were to come at it from a very Chomskyan perspective, you could say that speakers are born with this knowledge of kind of indirect versus direct causality and the grammatical structures that make that possible. Or if you're coming at it like I am from the other direction, you can say that these are products of linguistic evolution. So speakers of all languages find it important to talk about causes and to distinguish more direct causes from less direct causes, and that's why we've evolved similar grammars. So we can try and answer these questions with cross-linguistic studies, but it always comes back to the same debate. You can always interpret the data in these two different ways. So suppose we meet Martians or some from a different planet. How would their language be like ours? So it's, I guess, from my perspective at least, it's to do with the extent to which they are similar to us in the things they want to get across. So as I mentioned before with the cross-linguistic studies, the reason that English and Quiché and Hebrew all have these two different types of marking cause is that it seems important to us for human speakers to be able to discuss causes. So presumably this is because, if a guy goes around causing people to be dead, then, that's important that we can share that information. So if Martians or these speakers from whatever planet, if they had bodies like ours and they could cause injury to each other, or they could, do good things to each other, then I would expect that they would also have different ways of marking things like cause or who was doing what to whom in their language. But if they were something like, they were just amorphous gases and they didn't act upon one another, then I would think that they wouldn't have these types of ways of talking about cause, because it's not relevant to their society. Chomsky's latest thinking on this is that language evolved for thought. So that language evolved for humans to process their thoughts internally, and the fact that we can use it for communicating with other humans is just a kind of a happy accident, a byproduct of that. But I would have to say that view is kind of quite controversial even within Chomskyan circles. So Chomsky and some of his co-authors have argued that recently, but not all of the people who follow a Chomskyan view would say that. But yeah, certainly for those of us on the other side of the fence, language is all about communication, and the reason we have the grammatical structures we do is because it's important for humans to be able to convey these types of meanings. It all goes back to meaning and to pragmatics on our side. I think some of the favourite studies that I've done, and the studies that I've been involved with, but also similar ones done by other groups that I haven't, and these are studies that I mentioned before looking at inflection and morphology. So these morphemes that go on the ends of words to change things. And one particularly well-studied debate within this is the English past tense debate. So I guess a lot of people watching this video maybe won't have English as a first language, and they will have been taught in school that a regular past tense in English, you simply take the verb and put ed on the verb. So, walk, walked, or talk, talked. So this sounds very simple. So the earliest theories of how English native-speaking children learn the past tense were essentially just that. So they learn a rule that you can put an ed on the verb, and that's how it works. But what's interesting is when you look at it in a very fine-grained way, that rule seems to be an oversimplification. So English children, they don't always put the ed on the verb. Sometimes they miss it off, or sometimes they put it on verbs where it shouldn't be there. And what's really interesting is if you look at it in a fine-grained way, the likelihood of correctly supplying the past tense marker or not depends on the particular verb in a way that's to do with the sound of the verb. So it all looks very simple when it's written down, we write ed, but actually how that's pronounced, and remember children are learning this a long time before they learn to read or write, so the fact that it's all written ed is no use to them. So a lot of verbs in English, the regular past tense form actually ends in a t sound. So if you think of like missed, wished, hissed, as far as a child is concerned, it's not ed, it's t. So what the data suggest is that they're making a phonological generalization, not based on ed, but based on the sound of a word. So they're learning that a verb that ends in a fricative, so like miss, hiss, wish, dish, or whatever it might be, that these take t in the past tense form. So what's interesting is if you do studies where children are given novel verbs like to, I don't know, to friss or to gliss or something, the likelihood of them putting a past tense marker on that, so you say, here's a man who likes to gliss, he does this every day, so yesterday he, and the child will say glissed, maybe. So the likelihood of children doing that depends on how phonologically similar the novel word is to the words that children have already got stored in memory. So it doesn't look like, these results suggest, it doesn't look like they've got a regular rule that they can just apply to any verb. It sounds like they're producing past tense forms by simply storing all the forms that they know, and when they want to produce a new form, they're just making a phonological analogy, a sound-based analogy across the forms that they've got already stored. So there's no debate that children have a tendency to go beyond what they've heard and to say new things. And the past tense is a great example of that because my own daughter is right in the middle of this overgeneralization period at the moment. Pretty much every time she will say, we sitted down, we goed there, we eated that. She hasn't really learned any irregular forms yet. So children definitely have a tendency to go beyond what they've heard. The question is, how do we best explain that? So there's kind of three different approaches, actually, I'd say. So the first is the genitivist style approach, where it's the formal rule, you take the verb, you add ed on. The second is the kind of mainstream constructivist approach, where it's you store all the different forms and then you abstract across them to make some kind of generalization, but there's still some kind of abstraction. And then you have what I'm actually arguing for in my current writing is a more radical constructivist approach, which is called an exemplar approach, where you don't actually store any generalizations. All you store is the individual forms. So when you generate these novel forms, you're generating them on the fly as you go. You don't have any stored rules or generalizations or anything. All you have is the stored forms. And there are generalizations, yes, but they happen on the fly as you're producing language, as you're retrieving these forms, rather than there being stored generalizations. Until recently, it was thought that there was a critical period for language acquisition, which finished around maybe 5 or 6, that if you're not exposed to a language before that period, then you'll never be able to learn it to a native-like level. But what's interesting is that, but these were generally done on very small-scale studies, like 50 or 100 people. What's really interesting is a guy called Josh Hartshorn, who's based at Boston College in the US. He's recently run a huge crowdsourced study across the internet, and I think this is something we're going to see much more and more of, obviously not just in child language, but in science in general, or not just science even, but in everything we're kind of seeing the rise of big data, of web-generated data sets. So what Josh did was very clever. He got people to do an online quiz where it was a neural network, and it would take people's answers. It was like an English grammar quiz, and it would try and predict what was their native language and how long they'd been learning English and so on. But this was just the hook to get people in. Of course, what it was really doing, it was asking them what was their native language, how long had they been learning English, and he was feeding all of this into a big statistical model, which was testing this critical period idea, not just with 100 people or 1,000 people, but with, I think it was several million people that he managed to get to complete this study. And what he actually found was very interesting. He found that there does seem to be a critical period, but it doesn't finish at 5 or 6. It seems to finish around, I think it was something like 16 to 18. So, or was it even later? I'll have to look up the study, but anyway, it was in early adulthood, certainly, rather than childhood. So it obviously makes a difference how you learn. You're not going to become a native speaker just by kind of sitting in a classroom for an hour a week and doing a bit of homework. You need to have something like the experience that children get. But it's very encouraging for everyone who wants to learn English or another second language around the world to know that these critical periods do seem to extend much later than we had previously thought. So in terms of the relationship between language and other areas of child development, what's difficult is that the kind of genitivist versus constructivist debate that I mentioned in child language doesn't really have parallels in other areas. Obviously I'm a complete outsider to this field, but say maths, for example. Everyone pretty much agrees that kids just have to learn maths from being taught maths and kind of what they can figure out. There isn't really the idea that children are born with a kind of universal innate knowledge of mathematics that they have to map onto what they know. So it's difficult to draw parallels between language development and other areas. There are certainly overlap with things like concept development and so on. So the example I mentioned earlier about whether we store for language the individual exemplars or whether we form abstractions, that's a debate that's kind of already happened in cognitive psychology, not in a linguistic sense, but if we just set aside the word for it, so think about a cat, set aside the word cat, but just think of a concept cat. So there's kind of three different ways of talking about this. The old view was that we kind of had rules about, it must have 4 legs, it must have a tail and so on. But then this doesn't work because, you could have a plastic model cat or a picture of a cat to which none of these things apply. So then the next idea was that we had a kind of a prototype, idealized cat. So we store all our cats in our head and make an analogy across them and have some kind of perfect idealized cat, and we judge other cats with reference to this prototype. But then the third idea is this exemplar idea, that actually all we do is store every encounter we have with a cat or a picture of a cat, we just store all of those in our head. There isn't any separate abstraction process, and we just retrieve the necessary examples of a cat for whatever our task is at that purpose. And actually, no debate in science is ever settled conclusively, especially not in psychology when we can't look in people's heads. But I would say the exemplar view of category formation is probably the dominant one now within category formation. And I think language just needs to kind of catch up with the rest of cognitive psychology here. Yeah, computational models of child language acquisition are very important in our field. So in the old days, you had your theory and it was just kind of like people talk about 1970s box and arrows theory. So, you have a box and then the word comes in and then 3 arrows go out, long-term memory, short-term memory, the grammar, and, no one knows what this really means. But if you have a computational model, then you're forced to make your assumptions absolutely explicit. So some work that I've been involved with, I haven't done the computer side, but so the guy who did it's called Felix Engelman. He works with us at Manchester and Liverpool universities. And it was this, I mentioned before about how learning which marker goes on the end of a verb, so like played, plays in English and so on. But it's actually much more complicated than that in most languages, certainly in Russian, for example. And so we did some studies of Polish and also Finnish, and Polish is quite similar to Russian in a lot of these respects. And so the problem that kids have here is much more complicated than English-speaking kids, but we still think they solve it in the same way by storing all the examples and making a phonological analogy across them to generate these new forms. And what Felix did was built a computational model that does something like this. So it's given the stem of the word in Polish or Finnish, and it has to produce the fully inflected form of the verb. And it does it basically by doing what we're saying here, by analogizing across the stored forms that it has. So computational models are hugely valuable here, because if I just say we do it by analogizing across the stored forms, then people's natural reaction is, what the hell does that mean? Whereas if we say, okay, it works something like this computational model, which stores the forms and can use them to produce the output form, then what we're saying at least hopefully starts to look vaguely plausible. Okay, a question that comes up a lot in, particularly for second language learning, is whether some languages are easier or more difficult than others. And I guess there's two ways to answer it. The first is to say it kind of depends where you're starting from. So if you're learning, if your first language is English, then learning Hebrew is going to be horrendously difficult. But if your first language is Arabic, then learning Hebrew is going to be, easier than learning English. So learning a language from within your own language family, or one that's historically related to your own language, is obviously going to be a lot easier. I guess what people really want to know when they ask this question is, if we could somehow have an alien, would it be simpler for them to learn one language than another? Well, again, I guess it would sort of depend where that alien was coming from. But I think what happens is language tends to sacrifice complexity in kind of one part of the grammar and bring it in somewhere else. So English, certainly, I think it's probably easier to get to a kind of basic level of English than it is many other languages, just because, as I mentioned, when comparing English to Polish or Russian, we don't have all these different forms of a word. We have plays, played, playing, and that's it. We don't have igrаю, igrajesz, igrajecie, all these different forms that we have in other languages. So I think to get to a level where you can just say the words that you want to say, where you can just retrieve the vocab and spit them out in some order that will make some kind of sense, probably English is a little bit easier than what we call these highly inflected languages. But certainly to convince someone that you were a native speaker, I wouldn't want to say that any language is easier or more difficult than others, because the nuances that English can't do with morphology, it has to do with other ways like the vocab or the more rigid word order and so on. So these things tend to balance themselves out.
I would like to say a few words about brain bases of language. We know from patients, from neurological studies, that some parts of the brain are particularly important for language. Actually, the whole brain, the whole new part of the brain, the neocortex, which is especially large in humans, is important for language. However, there are specific parts of that big structure, the neocortex, which are of particular relevance for language. And one of them is in the frontal cortex. Another one, the second one, is in the temporal cortex, so behind the left ear. It's usually the left hemisphere, which is most important for language, in most of us at least. And we know from case descriptions, neurologists in the 19th century already described diseases that involved the frontal language center, which were accompanied by problem in speaking and also some difficulty understanding. And then the other one behind the ear, the temporal lobe lesion, also produced a problem in speaking and understanding. And those diseases were called then aphasias, language disorders after acquired brain injury in adults. So from these patients, we know which parts of the brain take the heaviest, the most burden or take most of the burden in language processing, so to speak. Now, why is that? We have models today that would actually account for that at least in part. We know that our brain has certain neuroanatomical structure. We know that our articulators at the mouth are controlled by a region, the so-called motor cortex, articulatory motor cortex, which is very close to this frontal language region. And we know that the cables from our ears that tell the brain about acoustic signals we process, they reach areas in the temporal cortex which are very close to those regions that would also be of particular relevance for language. So why then would these language regions take their home close to these inputs and outputs of language? Well, the explanation can be provided by neurobiological models, where we put in where we produce neural networks, so artificial brain-like structures, where we have a motor cortex, and then this frontal language region and the auditory cortex, the sound processing areas, and also the areas around those. And then we present this network with information we would actually produce and receive during language acquisition, during early stages of language learning. If I play a baby or an early language learner, I may first say syllables like senseless syllables such as ba ba ba, or later on single words like bat or car, and those would of course be require, in order to move my mouth, would require that some motor activation takes place, and also at the same time there's activation in the auditory system, because I hear myself speaking, and therefore we have at two very distant ends of the brain, if you wish, in the motor cortex, in the auditory cortex, in the front, in the back, we have correlated activation. And now I mentioned the term of correlation, and correlation is something very important, because our brain is particularly good at mapping correlations. It has learning rules that drive the strength between nerve cells according to the correlation of their firing. So if we have this correlation at different ends of our brain, when we speak, there will be strengthening of the links between these nerve cells. And because there are actually no strong connections between the motor cortex and the auditory cortex proper, the activation needs to take detours around, take regions in other parts of the frontal cortex, close by parts of the temporal cortex, and those now happen to be linked with each other. And that's a particularly important feature of the human brain, because only very recently it has been discovered that, especially in the left hemisphere, there are fundamentally strong connections between this frontal language area and this temporal language area that lead information back and forth between the two. So for mapping the correlation between motor and auditory neural activation, our brain, our human brain, is especially good, well developed, cut out for, if you wish. So the idea here I'm trying to bring forward here is that during our early language acquisition, when learning the first words, we would build neuronal assemblies, circuits of strongly connected nerve cells, one for every word and maybe larger construction, and thereby we built a vocabulary of words and longer chunks of language, which then become consolidated over time and form the building blocks of language. And now back to our aphasia data, our brain lesion data. Now we can use this type of model and lesion it in the front and lesion it in the back, and then find that our artificial neural networks do something very similar to what patients with the frontal and the temporal lesion do, they show deficits as our patients do. They have problems mainly in speaking when we lesion in the front, but there's also a detectable problem in understanding language and even single words if the lesion is in the front. But, and of course, if the back part, the temporal cortex, receives a lesion, there's a heavy language understanding problem. But also some difficulty finding the right words and composing the words in the correct way from their individual language sounds, phonemes. So we're here in the process of slowly but steadily improving our understanding of brain-language relationships. I have now only talked about words, and this is, of course, very simple topic relative to the complex syntax, and then the meaning of words and larger constructions, and finally the social interactions in which language plays a big role. But however, these biological mechanisms kick in already very early and at a very basic level, and at this higher level, more complex levels, we have similar situations. So the language machinery can slowly but steadily be explained a little better now using neurocomputational work, and of course looking at the patients in much detail, and of course a topic which we could elaborate on too, when we use neuroimaging and modern techniques to stimulate parts of the brain. So one possibility is to look at patients with language disturbances and describe their problems. They may have problems naming objects, say this is a glass, or they may have understanding problems. So if you show them the glass and maybe a hand, and you ask which is the hand, they may point at the wrong object. So these patient studies are one important part. Then we do neuroimaging. We use fMRI, EEG, MEG, magnetoencephalography, and look at the brain activation patterns elicited by speech sounds, by words, by little constructions, by complex sentences, or by whole interactions between communication partners. When I ask somebody to give me something and he or she responds, there are specific brain activation patterns we can map. And a different strategy is, of course, to play patients with healthy people. There are methods to slightly affect the functionality of the brain by magnetic stimulation. And by that we can produce mini lesions or mini activations very focally, much more focal than the usually big brain lesions. And then we can address the question, is a smaller part of the brain causally involved in language understanding? Just to take one example. In 2015, we published a paper where we showed that stimulating the motor cortex in the frontal lobe influences the understanding of single words. So some colleagues believe that the frontal cortex, and especially the motor system, is not so important for understanding. Certainly it's not so important as other parts of the brain, as the temporal language region. However, it also plays a role in understanding, and even at the single word level. We now know a little bit more, just a little bit more, about brain-language relationships, and we can even address the question why the language regions are placed in the brain where they are, and we can use neural network simulations mimicking the brain, artificial brain, so to speak, to provide explanations why certain aphasias, language disturbances, occur after specific lesions.
Speech, human speech, is unique in nature. There really is nothing else out there in terms of a sound that's like speech. The way that we produce the sounds of speech is just unparalleled in complexity. And sometimes we can forget how hard that makes speech perception and speech production as tasks, because by the time you're an adult, you've spent a lot of your life learning how to speak and you don't really notice it being difficult or effortful to do. But actually, there's a lot of work that the brain has to do, both to control the sounds of speech when you're speaking and also decode the sounds that other people are making. And there's been a lot of interest in this historically, partly because, of course, it can go wrong. So the first work that was really systematically looking at speech in the brain was done back by French and German neurologists trying to understand what was happening with patients. So they had patients who had problems with their brains and they wanted to understand what was going wrong. So we knew from that, so the work like Paul Broca or Carl Wernicke, that there were brain areas that seemed to be particularly important in controlling how we talk and also perceiving speech. And that's been very important and very influential. But one of the things that we've been able to do more recently is we've been able to use functional imaging techniques, literally to take photographs of the brain in action and actually start to go into this in a lot more detail. So there are some things that we do know about speech. So the language that you learn as a child, or the languages, they really shape how you can hear sounds as an adult. So babies are actually able to hear differences between speech sounds that adults can't hear, because by the time you're an adult, it's just kind of got grouped that way for your language. So one example would be the speech sounds at the start of the words red and lead. That's a r and a l sound for English speakers. If you are Japanese, those are allophones, the same sounds of the versions of the same speech sounds. So r, l distinctions are very difficult for Japanese speakers to hear and also to produce accurately. But all languages have this. So in English, the sound at the start of the word leaf is the same as the sound at the end of the word bell. So those are both L sounds for English talkers, and there are languages, I believe Russian's one, where in fact those would be two different speech sounds. So if an English speaker as an adult goes off to learn Russian, they can struggle with these sounds that are clearly different to a Russian speaker but sound like they're the same sort of speech sound for an English talker. So you've got this quite interesting kind of narrowing in, and that does seem to result in speech perception having some different characteristics from, say, how we perceive other things in our environment. We kind of group sounds together if they fit into particular speech sounds. And it's very interesting to think about how that is actually implemented in the human brain, because you are still talking about a sound. And what we've been able to do with these functional imaging techniques that we now have is actually go into the patterns of neural activation, how the brain is involved in teasing apart the sounds of speech. And it is very interesting because you sort of see this almost like a duality of how speech is processed in the brain, because at one end it's a sound and it activates parts of the brain that care about sound. But it's also a sound that you are treating differently because you can do something different with it. You can deal with this as speech. And you can actually see that happening as well. You actually see shaping of acoustic processing in the brain really quite early on in the brain that is shaped by the language you've learnt to speak. Because languages differ in the way that they treat sounds as being what we call phonetically relevant, sounds as being kind of having an importance and affecting what speech sounds are, different languages do that differently. So, for example, in English, vowel duration isn't a thing. If I say cat or cat, I've still said the word cat. Now, if you were Japanese, vowel duration changes the meaning of speech sounds. So, Tokyo and Tokyo would be two different words. Now that means you can actually, that sounds like, well, here's just a difference, but actually you can actually see in the brain Japanese and English talkers process vowel duration differently, even in meaningless words, really early on in the auditory system. So you sort of see the shaping of the auditory system towards the languages you speak. And then as you get further into the auditory system, you see the kind of acoustic stuff drop away, and you start to see a signal that's getting more and more specifically linguistic. So as you get further into the speech perception network, you see brain areas that care less and less about what that speech sounded like and more about what does that word mean? What's that linguistic signal? And interestingly, the further you go into the network, the more you see speech perception and speech production looking very similar. Such if I look at the brain areas that are involved in meaning and thinking about meaning, they are pretty much exactly the same if you are thinking about meaning in stuff you've heard or if you're thinking about meaning in what you're about to say. So you can sort of see going from sound through to meaning in the brain. And then, of course, when you are actually speaking, we see other brain areas recruited which are helping you do the business of actually producing speech. And then you sort of see that getting driven again. So there's a very interesting and complex network where you've got perception and kind of control of output. And in between, the really big mediating factor is language. It's linguistic representations that are independent. Those representations don't care if you've heard a word or read the word because it cares about meaning. And what we're very interested in is understanding how that works, because we can kind of see it as a network, but that doesn't tell us computationally what's going on. And it also doesn't tell us interesting things like, for example, in languages you have semantics, but of course you also have syntax. You've got grammar, and that's very strongly driving what sentences mean as much as the semantic content. And although languages vary a great deal in actually how they implement semantics and how they implement syntax, you've got this commonality, you always have both there. So what I'd be very interested in knowing is actually how this network that we see that seems to be generally involved in like high order representations of language, how much of that is being driven by semantics? How much of that is being driven by syntax, the rules of how we put language together? There are a number of different ways you can study speech. So one whole area looks at phonetics, and they are the people who are almost treated, it's like the linguistic end of understanding speech. So they're very interested in describing and classifying and theorising about the sounds of speech. There's also the world of engineering, because if you want to build a computer, that can understand speech, you have to think about many of the same problems that your brain deals with. And actually, one of the very interesting things that happens if you want to build a computer to understand speech is you don't go out looking for speech sounds at all, you look for sequences. Because of course, the way that we produce speech sounds isn't just a series of different segments, you actually, what's called co-articulate them, you run them together. So if I say the word Sue or the word see, that was both a S sound at the start, but actually the S in Sue is very different because I'm anticipating the U vowel than if I say see when I'm anticipating the E vowel, and that makes it sound different. Now that's all an S and you hear an S, but actually the signals are very different and there's information there. If you hear S or S, it's telling you what vowel is coming up. You want that information. So very interestingly, in the sort of engineering and the computer approach to decoding speech, they've picked up on a lot of the really important stuff that we can be fairly comfortable the brain is using. The brain isn't sort of breaking speech down by listening out for speech sounds and then sort of reassembling them into words. It seems to do something much more kind of active like that. So you've got the world of phonetics and you've got the world of engineering, and then of course you've also got the world of clinical issues, because you can look at what happens when speech goes wrong. So you can look at what happens in the brain of somebody who has difficulty decoding speech sounds, or somebody who has difficulty with semantic representations or syntactic representations, because if you can selectively damage particular kinds of speech sounds or particular kinds of words, it's telling us something about how the underlying system is working that can support that. And then of course we've also got psychology, which tells us a lot about how sort of perception and production work in the human brain, and there you're studying it as a sort of, in a behavioural way. So what I find very interesting about speech is you don't get the answer from any one of those. You need to know about all of it. You need to know about phonetics, you need to think about the computational issues, and you need to think about what you can learn from patients, because none of it on its own is going to help you understand this extremely complex phenomena. There's quite a lot of controversy at the moment about bilingualism, because some people argue that bilinguals have quite different brains. You train up your brain differently if you are bilingual than if you're monolingual. And that's controversial. Some people are making strong claims for that. For example, that there might be knock-on effects, that you would be protected from dementia by being bilingual because you sort of got this stronger language system. And other people are arguing that that's not the case. I think what is very interesting, if you actually look at the world, is that it is that the norm to be multilingual. Monolingual people, like you find a lot in the UK, they're the unusual ones. So actually, the brain is very good, the human brain is very good at dealing with multiple languages. If you have the opportunity to learn them when you're young, then you can cope pretty well with multiple languages. And there is a great deal of interest in this, because you could still say, well, is that language all in one place? Is it all sort of stored together, or is it sort of separated? So a lot of the questions around bilingualism in the brain are also trying to understand how it's actually implemented and how it works. I mean, would it be possible for one language to be damaged and the other to remain intact, for example? And it does seem that in bilingualism there is more commonality than you might think. So it doesn't seem that there is like a separation out of the different languages in the brain. You might be more familiar with one language. You might be in particular environments that make it easier to speak one language than another, because the people around you, say, are more fluent in that language. But it's not because your brain is somehow separately treating them. It's very interesting to think about the examples of people who are particularly skilled in languages, because you do meet people who are very, very good. They've learnt how to learn languages. They've learnt what to listen out for. I suppose there's the possibility that anybody could do that, and one of the limits on language learning tends to be time. You spend a lot of time learning languages when you're a baby, and you have a lot less time when you're an adult. But once you've separated that out, there does seem to be variation. Some people do seem to be better than others. And actually, there's quite a lot of interest in the underlying genetics of that, because there is the possibility that what we see in the population is a variation in linguistic ability that's kind of operating at this level, learning to learn, being able to sort of get to grips with linguistics, be able to produce new sounds of speech and kind of acquire those sequences. There's a lot of interest in how that might actually, variation in that might be underpinned by genetic variation. So there's been a lot of interest in the end at which people struggle to learn to speak. They struggle to acquire languages. They do it with difficulty. They find it hard to get it right. And there's a lot of interest in what might be going at the other end of that distribution. Would we find people who are particularly able and sort of have a facility with language and language learning that actually means they are more naturally polyglots? I think that the future of the field for speech processing is going to be, can we ever really quantify what's different about speech? Or is it just the case that there are some things humans do, because face processing is another example where we seem to show a tremendous facility for it, and we seem to deal with face information in a way that's different from other things that we look at. Is that something about faces, or something about their social meaning, or is it something about just we happen to have learned to deal with them this way because we have to? And the same's true with speech. So there's this tension. Are we looking at something which is a specialised skill, maybe something which we are predetermined to be good at, or is it something that we just happen to get really good at and we can use in this way? And so, for example, people have argued that if you look for it, maybe a lot of the stuff that we see in the brain when we look at speech perception networks is actually nothing to do with speech, and it's to do with sort of an expert recognition system. So if you took somebody who was an expert in some sort of other auditory world, like maybe identifying musical notes or recognising birdsong, would that look the same? Are we seeing anything speech specific at all, or is it all auditory expertise? So in short, I think one of the big questions for the future is going to be, is any of this specific to speech and language, or is it just the brain areas that do expert processing? There's some really interesting differences in how the brain processes visual information and auditory information. So auditory information doesn't hang around. If I make a sound, it's gone. Whereas a lot of the visual information in your world actually stays there. It might move about a bit, but it doesn't go anywhere. And also, you only hear a sound because something happened. Sounds are transient and they come from objects happening and actions happening to those objects, and then they're gone again. So, if something in my world visually can be there, as long as there's light, I'll know it's there. So you've got these differences, and another really interesting difference kind of links into the plasticity of how the brain deals with this information. So in the visual system, what you can find in lots of mammal brains are visual cells, single cells that care, for example, about lines which are at different orientations. So it'll like a line at this orientation, but not that orientation. And what you don't find in the auditory system is anything that fixed. So you can sort of see in visual processing almost like a building up of features, lines, shapes, bits. You can kind of reconstruct your visual world based on these basic features, like a palette of things to look for. And you don't find that in the auditory brain. In primate brains particularly, what you find is what's called heterogeneity in auditory responses. And that means that unlike a brain cell that might like lines at this orientation but not at that orientation, what you find in auditory areas are brain cells that go, well, I like sounds that have got amplitude variation, but I also like frequency variation, and I also like harmonic structure, and other things that might or might not be there. So instead of seeing brain areas that are looking for features, what you seem to see in auditory cortex are brain areas that look for, this right now might be important. This is an element of what I'm hearing that I might need to kind of process. So it's like a more general response. It will zoom into what happens to be relevant for the sounds that I'm currently processing, rather than waiting to see something. I like this kind of modulation and I won't respond until I get that. Now, what that means might be because sounds are transient, you have to process them quickly, and they can be, for example, really affected by the environment that you're in. So my voice sounds different in this room than it would do if I was standing outside in noisy traffic. But it's also the case that if we look at some communication sounds, it turns out the kind of plasticity which you get from this kind of very heterogeneous response in the brain actually helps you deal with a signal that can be highly variable. And there's different sorts of ways that that's important in the human brain. And the most obvious one, is we all talk differently. So you go out into the world and you might meet lots and lots of people who speak the same language as you, and they're talking the same language as you, but they are almost incredibly unlikely to actually do so in the same way. People speak differently because of their regional accent, because of their mannerisms, because they have idiosyncrasies in their particular production. So, for example, my son goes to school in central London, near UCL where I'm based, and there's a speech sound in English. There's speech sound in like or bike, the vowel that goes I, like, bike, right, and it's just going from London accents of English. Children say lack, back, rad, and when you first hear it you go, wait, what? And the next thing, you're just processing it. You just deal with it. It happens all the time. So you need to be very plastic in your response to speech, because you've got to be able to deal with somebody saying the word like lack, or like, or lack, all these different ways that people who speak the same language as you might actually produce it. So you've got this speaker to speaker variation, and plasticity helps you deal with that. Helps you just deal with the fact that there can be this huge variation out there in how people actually produce the same language, the same words technically can be said quite differently. The other situation where you find this is if you have problems with your hearing. So if you lose your hearing, get a hearing aid or get fitted with a cochlear implant, what you might have to do is start to understand the language that you normally speak that now sounds completely different. So with a cochlear implant, instead of a voice that you're hearing now, you hear something that sounds a lot more like a harsh kind of whisper. And people learn to adapt to that incredibly quickly. And indeed, if they learn to adapt to this when they are children, they can do amazing things with these cochlear implants. They can hear music, they can hear all sorts of stuff that technically they probably shouldn't be able to do. So actually the plasticity that's built into the system both helps us deal with day-to-day variation, which is always there, in encountering completely novel ways of saying the language that you're familiar with. And it can also help you if you have to deal with change, if you have to deal with a completely altered sounding input. There are really interesting questions around how this works in different countries, because you do find countries that have got great varieties in regional accents, and other countries like Australia where actually there's just not much regional variation. There are other things that influence accent, so more or less ochre, which is sort of more like almost like a class distinction, posh, less posh, that influences accent, and that partly is a function of social factors. It's also partly a geographical factor. So in the UK, some regions of the UK that didn't have very much interaction with the rest of the UK have preserved quite specific accents, whereas other accents like the London accent has changed really quickly and continues to change really fast because it's continuously getting this variation of new populations coming in and altering it. So that even in the UK this varies, and all countries are going to have different kinds of social and geographical factors that are intersecting with that. It's also the case that we just don't know what this does to your brain. We just don't know how this is actually implemented. I wouldn't be surprised if being able to cope with novel sounding people, even if there aren't accent differences, there will be individual differences that just aren't tied to location. They're idiosyncratic, they're specific to one person. If they're speaking the same language to you, you will tune into that. And I think it would be very interesting to know more about how this works across different languages, because historically what's tended to happen is this largely gets studied, if not in English, in Germanic languages. So there's even not much work in French in terms of the brain systems involved in decoding and coping with different voices. So I think it's one of the areas where we really need to take a step back and start doing more cross-cultural work at a brain level to start to get a sense for how different languages might be affected by this, and the sort of social and economic and geographical stuff that feeds into the accent differences or lack of them. When you think about people talking, we can study it by understanding brains and thinking about brains, but we can never forget about the social dimension, because it's always relevant and it's always important, and it is going to be influencing how the brain is processing that signal. So for example, there was some very nice work from Holland that they just played people's stories, and the stories had been modulated such that the sound sh and the sound s kind of got mixed together. They didn't tell people, work out what's going on here, But what people did was they immediately adapted. They just listened to the story, but they adapted their perception of the difference between s and sh. And if you then took them and tested them to tell the difference between s and sh sounds, it had actually shifted, but only for that talker. So there's a human being behind the changes that their brain has made. They haven't remapped their whole phonetic system, they've just done it for that one person. So you can't really separate out the social aspects from those really kind of nitty-gritty cognitive brain level changes. I suspect at its heart the plasticity that we see in the auditory system probably relates to the requirements of dealing with sound. Sound is strange, it can vary a lot, it can be completely, you know, if you're in a very, very noisy room and you're trying to make out what your friend is saying, you've got a very different kind of acoustic task there than if you are dealing with that same friend on the phone or talking to you in a quiet room. So the same task is made completely different by the acoustic environment that you're in. And because sounds go, you've got to deal with them very quickly. They don't hang around for you to inspect and pay more attention to. They've already gone. So I think the auditory system has to be really active and it has to be very plastic to deal with the demands placed upon it. It simply is different to visual information. Although, of course, some visual information has these characteristics too. As soon as you look at visual movement, you've got this same problem of things are already gone. The movement is already gone by the time you want to, go back and think about it. So maybe we'll see similar properties if you look at the processing of dynamic information generally. Maybe it's not sound specific, maybe it's to do with dynamics. But I think also the variability of our acoustic world, and also, of course, the fact that it can go wrong. That does seem to be something which is quite an interesting property. The people's ability to cope with quite altered auditory inputs is quite interesting. In the field, one of the things we're very interested in is how we can best sort of understand this plasticity. So one of the things that we've found is that the differences between people who can adapt very well to very different sounding speech and the people who adapt a lot less well wasn't associated with differences in auditory parts of the brain. It was to do with higher order parts of the brain that seemed to be, an influence backwards almost onto how the auditory system was engaging. And that was very interesting, but it does speak to a sort of tension. Are you looking at perceptual systems and their adaptation, that might vary across people, or are we looking at higher order, maybe attentional or linguistic systems that are kind of guiding that? And there's a real tension there because some people feel very strongly it's got to be all driven up by a sort of a perceptual inwards process, and that there's not the sort of the scope for these even using the phrase top down can really enrage people. But it's also the case that we know, for example, that there are continuous loops of processing between cortex and subcortical fields that are really important in auditory processing. So actually, maybe it's not really meaningful to talk about bottom up and top down. Maybe everything we're seeing, even the bottom up stuff, actually is reflecting this continuous looping of the processing of the auditory signal between cortex and the ascending auditory pathway, which does a huge amount of very complex processing on sound. So I think one of the things we're going to have to tackle is the inherent complexity of that, and actually understanding some of these, they're called corticothalamic loops, that it means that we can't just draw an arrow going ear up to brain. You're seeing these continuous looping even before you start to engage other brain areas influencing this. So we have to engage properly with the complexity, I think, and I think that's going to start telling us more about how this plasticity works and how, for example, it might vary across people.
Dyslexia is a very strange condition. It means inability to learn to read. And you might think, surely that can be explained by not having the right home environment, not having the right teacher, not having the right school, or maybe being really very stupid. But none of this applies. There is really a condition that means that you can't learn to read as well, as quickly as you can learn to do all other things. So it's a very specific kind of difficulty, a problem. And what people have always been suspicious about is, why should it have to do with reading? I mean, reading, after all, has been invented only about 3,000 years ago. And mass literacy hasn't been around for more than possibly 100 years. Even now, there are many people who are not literate. So how can there be a condition based on an ability that must be based in the brain that, you know, has to do just with reading? Well, it turns out that the ability is about something else, which affects learning to read. And interestingly, it's an ability that has to do with speech. Not language, but speech. And it has to do with a particular possibility of segmenting speech into tiny little sounds that can be matched up to letters. So if you hear the word cat, it's actually one sound. But when you are literate, when you are a person who can spell k-a-t, it seems to you that you can separate cat into k-a-t. But actually, you can't put them together and make cat. It's just completely separate. It's a very artificial way of breaking up the sound of speech. So in a language that has a writing system that's not based on the alphabet, this problem doesn't arise. So dyslexia is something pretty specific to the alphabet, to the use of the alphabet. And if you have a difficulty in mapping individual speech sounds to letters, you will find it very difficult to learn to read and to spell. It doesn't make sense to you. So when the teacher says to the child, you know, the child is struggling to read and the word is lion, and the teacher might say l, l, to help the child, l, l. The child may suddenly say tiger because there's so little relationship to the sound. It gets so little help from this. Another child will maybe use the l to produce the word lion. So it's this difficulty which is at the heart of dyslexia. And it's very interesting because it tells us something about how we master speech in general and how it comes that, you know, 95% of the population has no problem, but maybe 5% of the population do have problems. And again, it can be a spectrum of severe difficulty and very mild difficulty. It means that we do have children who struggle enormously in learning to read and to spell, and they need years and effort, and they have to believe very often that they are just very stupid, and which just isn't the case. So it has consequences in real life. Very often consequences that lead to opting out of school altogether, probably behavior problems, all sorts of things. Now, it turns out that you can understand the brain basis of dyslexia if you look at this difficulty in sound segmentation. And we have developed some tests that get at this difficulty. We call it phonology tests. So this is the phonemes are these artificial sounds that map onto letters of the alphabet. And one test, for example, is just repeating back not long, quite complicated nonsense words. Dyslexic people find that very, very hard. They just can't really quite repeat these words. Or we ask for the first sound of a word to be split off and transposed. So we have a word pair, for example, lemon, basket, and you should transpose the first sound so it becomes bemmen, blasket. And this seems incredibly difficult for a dyslexic person. But then there are others who can do it, but just very slowly. So it's a very sensitive test of this phonological difficulty. And in this way, we could diagnose people who didn't even know they were dyslexic. Even adults who had a dim memory of school and saying, I didn't like it, it was a terrible time. And yeah, I was never a good speller and I couldn't do it very well. And we could find that there is indeed an area in the brain. Again, it's not just one area, it's several that are connected with a particular highway in the brain, that they have a different kind of activation when they do these tasks, these phonological tasks. And in this sense, dyslexia has revealed something not so much about reading and literature, but about speech and how we process it. Spelling is a very interesting activity in English, because the way a word sounds and the way it looks can be very disparate from each other. So take the word cough. It's not C-O-F, it's C-O-U-G-H. Now, if you're dyslexic, that is a real problem for you to remember. And if you have the sound O-U-G-H, it's not always off. It can be ow sometimes. So the pronunciation can be very, very changeable. And that is why in English, in the English language, wherever it is spoken, wherever it is taught, dyslexia will be very prominent. But in languages where the way that the writing system is produced so that it is really transparent and really maps very clearly onto sounds, dyslexia is much less evident. Now, we have done a study of this with Italian speakers. Italian is a beautiful language who has a system that is very, very transparent. If you think of a word like Milano or salami, it is consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel. It is very reasonable and easy to split these up into different phonemes. So even if you have a problem with phonology, even if you are destined to be dyslexic, if you have the good fortune to be born Italian, you will learn to read and to write much more quickly than if you were born into a country where they speak English. Dyslexia, defined as a problem with phonology, is a genetic problem, and it's really very strongly heritable. So in Italy, we can identify these people just as much, even though they have actually very little problem in reading. So some people might say, let's not call them dyslexic. Well, they are called dyslexic for traditional historical reasons, because there is a difficulty in learning to read using the alphabet. And even the Italian children, it turns out, read more slowly, learn more slowly than the non-dyslexic children. So there is an environmental component, a cultural component in the way the problem manifests itself in reading problems. Interesting biological effects which are universal, regardless of language, and there are cultural effects which mean there are big differences according to language, whether in fact you have a reading and writing problem.
Many ways in which we use language, but probably one of the most prominent ones is to ask questions, to ask for information. And so it's obvious that it's built into a natural language that we can ask questions using that language. And no matter what language you speak, you can always ask, when did you go there? Or who did you see? Or would you like to do this or that? So this is what questions are about. And so the question about questions has to do with the range of variation in natural language in terms of how those questions can be expressed. There are about 7,000 languages in the world, and of course we only have information about, let's say, 200 at best. So when people say most languages do X, that's a very rabid exaggeration, because most means probably the 50 that I know about. There are two ways to find out what other languages do. You can either just go around and check each and every of the 7,000 languages. That will take a while, and I probably won't be around until we get the answer. Or we can combine what we know from linguistic theory with our observations on linguistic facts and try to bring them together in building some kind of a picture of cross-linguistic variation. So both approaches are, of course, quite valid, and questions are particularly important in that regard. So there are essentially three types of questions that every language has: so-called polar questions, content questions, and what the hell questions. So let's start with what the hell questions. So in English, these questions take their name from what the hell are you doing, or where on earth are you going? And this is the sort of expressions which probably shouldn't be called questions, because when you say what the hell are you doing, you're not asking for an answer, you're just expressing that you're not happy. These questions are very varied, but again, every language has a way of expressing my unhappiness, and sometimes it's in the form of questions. The other two are polar questions and WH questions, yes/no questions and content questions. So yes/no questions are questions like, are you going there tomorrow, or did you do that? English, in fact, is quite unusual, because in order to ask a polar question in English, you have to change the order of the subject and the verb. So in English we'll say, I went there yesterday, but then we'll say, did you go there yesterday? And so this is called subject auxiliary inversion, SAI, which has received a lot of accounts and a lot of explanations in theoretical linguistic literature, which is completely disproportionate to how rare it is. So out of the 1,000 languages that Matt Dreyer studied, there are probably 13 that have this subject auxiliary inversion. So it's kind of remarkable that such a secondary character in linguistic literature has received so much attention. Mostly, when you want to ask a polar question, you either just change your intonation, or you put a little question particle on the end. And the prosody or intonation is particularly important, because typically people say a declarative sentence with their voice falling down at the end, something like they lived happily thereafter. And if they ask a question, then there is a rise. They lived happily thereafter, something like that. You can do that in pretty much any language. The expectation is that we use the fall at the end of the declarative and the rise at the end of the question, because the rise means I'm not done, I want more information. And so that's used as the account as to why we normally see a rise in polar questions. But as everything in linguistics, there are exceptions to this rule, and there are quite a few languages which actually do the opposite. So Native American language Chickasaw uses the rise for normal declaratives, and it uses the fall for questions. So they lived happily thereafter, and the question will be they lived happily thereafter. More importantly, there are a couple of American dialects and Belfast uptalk, Belfast English, which also use the same. So probably the most famous American dialect, which does the opposite, using the rise for declaratives and the fall for interrogatives, is what's called Valley Girl talk. So where they'll say, so I'm going to the store, and then if you ask questions like, where's the salon? So that's an indication that we really need to know what exactly the prosody is in a particular language, but the clear generalization seems to be that whatever the contour of your declarative is, your question will have the opposite of that. Now, if we now go to WH questions, there are essentially three strategies that people use in asking content questions or WH questions, like what did you eat or what did you read? The most obvious one is we take the WH word, what, where, when, who, and so on, and put it in the front. And again, this is something we're very used to from English. So who did you invite? Where did you go? When was your birthday? And so on. If we look at the distribution of linguistic types, it actually turns out that this is probably the least common strategy. Just like with the subject auxiliary inversion, where English was in the minority, this one is also in the minority. A much more common strategy is to put the WH word where it should be if you were answering the question. So something like, you went where yesterday? That's called WH in situ questions. And so questions like that are found in Chinese, in Uzbek, in Japanese, and so on. So there are lots and lots of languages that do that. And then finally, probably the most remarkable or most unusual strategy of asking WH questions is to make the WH word into a verb or predicate. So instead of saying, what did you do? It would be something, your doing was what? And this is the strategy that's really hard for us who speak in the European languages to visualize, but it's extremely common, and it's found in quite a few languages. We do see it across the world in Austronesian languages. We find it in Mayan. We find it in some languages of Africa. And this strategy is particularly important to linguistic theory because it basically tells us something extremely important about the nature of those content WH words, which is that they indicate focus. Focus is something that the sentence is about, the new information. Because WH word is asking for new information, it does correspond to the place of the new information. And there's no better place for new information in the sentence than the predicate. And so, in fact, if we were thinking of how to build a natural language, to build it from scratch, we would probably want to have WH predicates all over. And we would put languages like English and Japanese somewhere in the minority. So I've given you three different strategies of asking content questions. Then the obvious question we want to ask, going back to the 7,000 languages, is whether or not we can find any correlations which will allow us to predict which languages will use which particular strategies. And I can't say that we've identified all the correlations to the point that it's foolproof, but there have been a couple of things which have been extremely promising. One of the correlations is that if you have a language that uses WH words in situ or in place, like in Japanese, then this language is more likely than not is going to have what's called question particles. So if you speak Japanese, you will know that in Japanese, when you ask a question, you put your WH word, content word, where it belongs, and then at the end of the question, you put ka. So it'll be something like, yesterday you what saw ka. That's going to be the order. And so this ka says, I'm a question. And this is what typically allows us to put WH words in place. And so that's one of the correlations. So you go look at languages which have question particles, you find question particle, you can say more likely than not, this language will use WH questions in place. Another correlation which we find quite a bit has to do with the word order. So generally languages are divided into three main subtypes depending on what their word order is. Languages like English or Russian, where we start with the subject, then we have the verb, then we have the object. Languages like Japanese, where we start with the subject, then we have the object, then we have the verb at the end. And those languages are the majority. And then finally, languages where the verb is first. Languages like that are represented by Irish, or Mayan languages, or Hawaiian, and Berber, for example. In those languages, the ones that start with the verb, it's very common to have predicate WH questions. So again, we see a correlation, and the correlation may have something to do with the fact that the predicative information goes first. So we've established those three subtypes, and we've established some correlations, and the next thing that we need to do in understanding the theory of WH questions cross-linguistically is to see what our WH words, content question words, are synonymous with. Again, in familiar languages, words like who and what and where stand by themselves, stand on their own. But there are plenty of languages where one and the same word can be used to say who and somebody, or what and something, where and somewhere. So So these languages are known as languages with indeterminates. And although we know a fair amount about those languages, we still need to find out what exactly it is that will determine the distribution of those ambiguities and how they will interact with WH words and WH questions. So this is probably going to be the next frontier in the study of questions. People often think of linguistics as something that you do sitting in your office thinking deep thoughts. So basically it's an armchair theoretical investigation which is done by a lonely linguist. And the image is that of a lonely linguist or lonely philosopher or lonely philologist. They all kind of look alike. And this is how linguistics used to be until very, very recently, where the thought process was roughly this. You'd think about some phenomenon in language. You would ask yourself, can you say X? Can you say Y? You would then go and ask a couple of your friends. And based on what everybody said, you would compare a couple of forms and decide which one of them is better than the other. But as the low-hanging fruit has been collected, we've started seeing that there are a lot of phenomena in language which are subject to tremendous variation. And it's not enough to think your own deep thoughts or ask a friend or a couple of friends, because people will have very different judgments. In a lot of linguistic theorizing based on English syntax, there is this assumption that you can never ask a question of a part of a subject. So for example, what did a book about sell well? And indeed, this is not a good sentence of English. But if you start looking at something like, what did a bottle of break? That's not such a bad sentence of English. It turns out that although the assumption is that you shouldn't be asking questions out of subjects, some questions out of subjects are better than others. So that led to the observation that there are a bunch of phenomena in language which may have some kind of graded effects and which are subject to gradable judgments. Another observation that people have made was that linguists often have judgments which are very different from the rest of the people. There was a study where a researcher in England took a lot of sentences which are used in linguistic textbooks and asked a bunch of janitors, a bunch of undergrads, and then a bunch of academics in the UK whether they like those sentences or not. It turned out that the academics were okay, but the janitors and the undergrads completely rejected a lot of the material which used to be bread and butter of theoretical linguistics. So all those observations led to the conclusion that we need to get outside of our studies and stop thinking deep thoughts and asking our friends, but try to establish more experimentally based investigations where the data would come from large groups of speakers. So that led to the development of what's now called behavioral approaches to linguistics, where we will conduct large-scale surveys asking many, many people what they think of a particular question or a particular set of sentences or a particular sound. It's now extremely easy to do because there are a bunch of online sites which allow us to do that. For example, there is this wonderful site called the Amazon Mechanical Turk. So if you think about Mechanical Turk, that was a precursor to the human robots of our days. The Mechanical Turks were invented in the 17th century by German researchers, and now they have this website where you can put any kind of experiment, be it in linguistic or non, and ask people to judge your data. And in 24 hours, you'll get massive data on a bunch of various things. So just recently we did a big study looking at the resumption in English, where we're asking people whether it's okay to say something like, this is the person that when the police arrested him, everybody was happy. Textbooks on English say that's bad. Everybody speaks like that. So the question is it really good or bad? And so Mechanical Turk is just one of the examples which allows you to get a lot of data. So now you've totally changed the landscape of how you determine the material that you work on. So you've got massive data, and you can certainly apply various statistical models which will allow you to work on that. But the question then is how to feed this back into the theory, because it's not enough to just get massive data and to say, okay, well, my data are much cleaner than the data which were established in 1968 when there was no Mechanical Turk. The big question is whether or not we can ask questions in such a way that the answer will establish will change the foundations of our linguistic theory. So let me give you a couple of examples. One has to do with the formation of what's called relative clauses. A relative clause is a clause of the type, this is the person who left yesterday. Who left yesterday is a relative clause. In quite a few languages, you can never make a relative clause out of the subject of the transitive. So you can say, this is the person who left, but you cannot say, this is the person who wrote this book. And so the question is, why? One of the hypotheses is that this has something to do with the difficulty that the real-time processing of such sentences imposes on human parser. And so obviously, in order to test this hypothesis, we need to look at the languages which allow you to form relative clauses, like this is the man who wrote the book, and then compare this is the man who wrote the book to this is the man who left, and compare them together to this is the book that the man wrote. And if we do find that this is the man who wrote the book is really more difficult than the others, we can then hypothesize that the languages that don't allow you to form those relative clauses are basically just taking this constraint to the extreme, turning what's called a soft constraint into a hard constraint. And so this is an example where linguistic theorizing could actually benefit from processing study. To make a long story short, we've run some studies like that, and we've discovered that there is no penalty for saying this is the man who wrote the book. That means that those languages which don't allow such relative clauses, don't allow them for reasons which are other than processing. So now you're sending your linguist back to his study where he's going to sit and think deep thoughts and stroke his beard and try to come up with a purely theoretical solution because the processing explanation has not worked. On the other hand, there are some explanations which actually take us away from structure. And to illustrate that, let me go back to this case of resumption, which I presented earlier, and that is, this is the man that when the police arrested him, everyone was happy. So every English grammar book says that's bad. People say that a lot. And there have been quite a few linguistic theories which are very, very complicated, but basically they indicate that this resumptive pronoun him, and this is the man that when the police arrested him, this resumptive pronoun is there because it's needed to show that something has been taken out of its initial position and put into a different position. So in a way, what people say is very deeply tied to their grammatical representation. So in order to test that, you need to see if people in a large scale do accept resumptive pronouns, and if they accept them, let's say, better in the object position than in the subject position, and so on. So again, to make a long story short, we've done a study like that, and we have found that there's absolutely no improvement for listeners when they hear a resumptive pronoun, which means that the theoretical foundation on which the theory of resumption in English has been built is completely wrong. That means we need to think what happens. And so it turns out that people like resumptive pronouns when they speak, and they like them in particularly when they make a pause. So something like, this is the man who, pause. When the police arrested him, and then you keep going. So this means that resumptive pronouns are not really a phenomenon of grammar, but more or less a strategy that selfish speakers use when they start speaking and they realize that they've kind of painted themselves into the corner, but they don't want to revise the whole thing. So if that's the case, then we need to put them into the box of our strategies for continuing my own thought, instead of putting it into some very complicated syntactic box where it used to be. And so this is just another illustration where linguistic theory has benefited from using more experimental methods. And until we had done that, people would be just thinking, oh, I can say that or I cannot say that. Lately, there's been a lot of really interesting work where people have looked at massive behavioral data, looking at how people judge certain sentences, how long it takes them to answer a certain question, because reaction time is also very important. And obviously the question is, where do we go next? And I would like to identify two areas where we can go next. The first frontier that we want to get to next is figuring out how language is processed in the brain. And this is where experimental approaches to language have to be very important. Every language has relative clauses, so it's been extremely important for experimental work. And this is the area where people have started looking at linguistic representation in the brain. So you give a speaker of Japanese or a speaker of Russian or a speaker of Spanish two sentences. One is, this is the man who wrote the book, and the other is, this is the book that the man wrote, and see whether or not their brain responses are different. So the question is twofold. First, whether or not the person will respond to the two relative clauses in a different way. And second, whether a speaker of English and a speaker of Japanese would respond differently. The initial results indicate that there is not much difference between speakers of Japanese and speakers of English in terms of how they process those structures in the brain, which is a very important result because it tells us that whatever the cognitive underpinnings of language are, they trespass and surpass individual linguistic barriers. So that's the next frontier, and we have ways to go beyond relative clauses. We have lots and lots of things that we can study. So the second step or the second area where we want to take our experimental approaches to language has to do with reformulating our theories and then asking particular theoretical questions concerning, let's say, a certain area of language. Let's say you speak a language which has genders. Russian is such language, or Spanish is such language. On the other hand, you have languages like English where there's no gender. Is there any difference between how people who speak a gendered language, like Russian or Spanish, keep their nouns in their head as opposed to speakers of English? On the surface, there doesn't seem to be any difference, but if we don't see any difference, then we don't really know why gender is needed. And so there is no way to answer this question without doing experimental work. And so this is another area or another illustration of how experimentation finds its way into linguistics and totally revamps the field. I think that in the years to come, we'll see a lot of really exciting developments there in both mapping language in the brain and answering more complicated theoretical questions based on experimental data. So it's very common to assume when people talk about language that everyone speaks a particular language and speaks it well. And this assumption comes from large countries with large dominant languages like English in the United States, or Russian in Russia, or Chinese, or Mandarin in China. So if you have a large country, everyone's supposed to learn the large language. And if they don't, it's their problem. But if you think more deeply, and if you look at the history of human society, it's in fact much more common for people to speak two or more languages. And if we look at that from that angle, we realize that monolingualism, when someone speaks only one language and uses it most of the time, is more of an aberration rather than the norm. So in a way, the way sociology and linguistics have positioned themselves is looking at the aberration and treating it as the norm. And so obviously, it's important to think about what the consequences of bilingualism. And lately, there's been a lot of new research which shows that bilingualism gives people significant cognitive advantages. So let me give you two examples. One has to do with a recent study which was done in Florida. Florida is, of course, where everybody goes when they turn 70. And so there are a lot of really old people in Florida. And a lot of these people live in assisted living or nursing homes. There was a study which they did in one of the nursing homes where they looked at about 800 subjects, asking whether or not they grew up bilingual. And they discovered that the likelihood of having Alzheimer's is 5 times less in people who grew up bilingual than in monolinguals. So that's not a bad result, especially now that everyone is trying to live longer and they've figured out how to deal with heart disease and cancer. So we might all end up in a nursing home, and it's not a bad thing not to have Alzheimer's. So that example comes from the other end of life and has to do with what's called wonder babies. This was a study which was done a few years ago in Trieste, which is basically at the border of Slovenia and Italy. So there are a lot of Italians and there are a lot of Slovenians, and there are, of course, a lot of mixed marriages. So what they did was they took 3 groups of babies. All the babies were 7 months old, so there were a bunch of Italian-speaking babies, a bunch of Slovenian-speaking babies, and a bunch of Italian-Slovenian babies from mixed families. They showed those babies various puppets, and then they switched the situation. And typically when a 7-month-old baby is used to a particular setting and the situation switches, it takes them a little while to regroup. So it turned out that 7-month-old Italian and 7-month-old Slovenian babies would get used to the puppy appearing on the right, and then when the puppy would appear on the left, they would continue looking to the right as if nothing had changed. Whereas the bilingual babies very quickly would turn their head and notice that the puppet has changed its position. So again, an indication that all other factors being equal, there was something that made those babies more advantageous. And these are just a couple of examples indicating that people do really improve when they speak more than one language, especially if that happens from birth or at least in the first 5 years of life. Doesn't mean that everyone has to drop everything, and if you're 51 years old, start learning another language. That will help only marginally. But if you were born in a situation where 2 or more languages are spoken, or if there are languages that you were exposed to as a child, that certainly gives you an advantage. The question is why? And I'm going to give you one of the possible hypotheses, which is very rapidly being explored in different fields of these days. The idea is that the control of languages has to do with what's called executive control, which is your portion of cognition that is responsible for attention and the distribution of tasks. So let's say if you're driving a car, you spend a lot of your energy and a lot of your memory resources into looking at the road and ignoring what's happening around. So the reason we don't want to text when we're driving is that this will distract us from keeping attention on the road. A lot of energy is spent on not paying attention to things which are not related to our driving. Likewise, when you have 2 languages or more represented in your brain, when you speak one, a lot of your energy and a lot of your memory resources go into suppressing the other language, which is constantly present in your cognition. And precisely because you're so experienced as a bilingual or multilingual speaker at suppressing the other languages in your representation, your executive control is better. And in a way, you exercise it way more than, let's say, a monolingual speaker does. And that leads to significant cognitive advantage. Obviously, there are different shades of bilingualism and multilingualism, and so once we discover that there are cognitive advantages, there are all kinds of questions that people ask. One of the questions is whether or not it's better to speak 3 languages than 2. At present, we don't see any significant advantage in the presence of 3 languages as opposed to 2. Another question has to do with whether or not it's better to introduce 2 languages sequentially or simultaneously. People have been long worried about raising bilingual children because the worry is that bilingual children have smaller vocabularies in each language than monolingual children. And that's kind of obvious because there are, 18 waking hours in a day, and let's say 9 hours you hear language X and the other 9 hours you hear language Y. So of course you'll hear half of the information that you'd hear if you were just a monolingual speaker. So up to age 5, we do find that bilingual children have smaller vocabularies in each of those languages, but eventually they catch up. So I don't think that this would be a significant worry because this is not something that is going to last. And so it's important to just keep doing that. The argument for sequential bilingualism as opposed to simultaneous bilingualism are not terribly serious. And it looks like simultaneous bilinguals are better at certain tasks compared to sequential bilinguals, but sequential bilinguals are better at other tasks. And so the jury is still out as to which of those 2 is better. What matters is the amount of exposure and not the order in which the languages were introduced. And then finally, people often worry about the role of literacy in bilingualism and multilingualism, saying that, you know, what's the point of learning a language which doesn't have literacy? Let's say if you're a speaker of Hmong living in the United States, and there is a large Hmong community in Minnesota, the Hmongs kind of look down upon their language because they don't see what the use of it is. There is no huge literature. And in English, of course, you've got everything from Shakespeare to Quentin Tarantino, and you want to use all that. But literacy is secondary to language. And there are millions and millions of speakers who speak languages with no literacy or with just the oral tradition. And they still have significant knowledge and significant cognitive advantages. So the presence or absence of literacy in a particular language is not a deciding factor in determining whether or not you want to raise your child bilingual or monolingual. The disadvantages have to do first with the smaller vocabularies which show up in the beginning, and like I said, that usually catches up around age 5. The other disadvantage may have to do with the unequal distribution of languages. One language is significantly weaker than the other. You will see that there will be some kind of a transfer or interference from the stronger language to the weaker language. So these are probably the two main factors that people bring up. One of the big issues in understanding bilingualism is what the input should be for bilingual or multilingual speakers. For example, if a child grows up in a family where the mom speaks language X and the dad speaks language Y, should they all be speaking X, or should they all be speaking Y, or should it be one parent, one language? Until recently, the idea had been one parent, one language. So if your mom speaks Chinese and your dad speaks English, the mom should only speak English, the dad should only speak Chinese. That's a really difficult model to follow up on, and it only happens in an ideal world. So basically, the notion that we've followed lately is that it's just good to have as much exposure to a particular language as possible. And then the question is, of course, whether or not there should be language X spoken in the family and language Y spoken in the society. And this is where, again, the importance is in the input. The reason that we have a lot of minority languages whose speakers start losing them is that the societal pressures are much stronger than the pressures of the family. And so if the family can just increase a lot of input by, let's say, taking a person to the country where this language is spoken as the main language, this is the best. There was a very nice study on Finnish spoken in the United States by Helena Halmari, who noted that people who grew up in the United States speaking Finnish in the family but did go to Finland every summer were much stronger in their Finnish than people who only learned Finnish in the family and were exposed to English. So basically, the crucial word is INPUT, input, and that's what matters. I don't need to convince myself that bilingualism is important, but I think we still have a lot of work to do in the general public, convincing people that bilingualism is the way of life. And there are a lot of issues here. Some of them are economic issues because bilingual programs, bilingual education costs money, and when the money is tight, it's always hard. And it's also something that varies from country to country. Living in a large country, I'm very used to the model that everyone has to speak English and this is the way of life. And English is, of course, the language that everyone wants to learn. If you go to smaller countries like Switzerland or the Czech Republic, bilingualism is more of the norm. And so my hope is that both linguistic research and educational policies will lead to the whole world becoming one big Switzerland rather than the whole world becoming one big United States or Russia. Imagine the situation that you have a family which moves from one country to another. And this family has a bunch of kids, and those kids grow up in this family. At first, they're only exposed to the language spoken in the family. Let's say if we look at the United States, It could be a Korean or a Russian family living in New York, and the kid listens to Korean or to Russian. But then this kid starts going outside and playing with other kids. Then the kid goes to preschool and starts learning some English, no matter how hard the parents try not to expose that kid to English at first. So at some point, the kid becomes bilingual in the home language and in the English that's spoken around him or her. And eventually, what happens is that the kid becomes more dominant in English, and their Russian or Korean becomes much weaker, to the point that sometimes when children are in middle school, they stop speaking the home language and start talking to their parents in English. And parents still try to talk to them in the home language. So this is the breakdown of communication. So the end point of this bilingualism is what's called heritage language. So essentially it's a form of bilingualism which is known as receptive or recessive bilingualism. In an ideal world, you would imagine that being bilingual means knowing two languages really, really equally well. But it's almost like the notion of an ideal husband, which is non-existent probably. So even if someone is very stably bilingual, one of the languages wins, and so they know one for like 51% and the other for 49%. And you can usually tell by seeing what people do in those languages when they count or when they're scared. This is when you see the dominant language at work. So heritage language is the phenomenon of recessive bilingualism, when one of the two languages becomes much, much weaker. But what makes those languages special is that the heritage language is the language which is acquired first, started at birth. So the dominant language is the one that comes in second or even third and kicks out the previous languages. The reason those languages are interesting, and that is heritage language, is that they allow us to see what's vulnerable and what's strong in human language in general. The field is fairly new. It's been around for, let's say, 15 years, but as we've been looking at more and more instantiations of heritage language, we've been noticing that regardless of what the dominant language is and regardless of what the heritage language is, there are a lot of recurrent tendencies which indicate that there is this kind of general architecture that human languages are organized by, and this architecture underlies the process of language learning. So by looking at heritage languages, we're able to reveal more of this linguistic blueprint that languages are organized by. The other reason that heritage languages are particularly interesting is that there is this theory which was actually developed by a Russian linguist, Roman Jakobson, who used to teach here at Harvard. And the theory was first in, last out, whereas Jakobson would say first in, last out, because the joke goes that Jakobson spoke Russian in 6 languages. So the first in, last out theory is that whatever is acquired early is forgotten the least and is lost last. Let's say when people start losing their language, when they start forgetting language because of brain injury or because of aging. There is a particular sequence of events which we all go through as we learn our first language. And by looking at heritage languages, we can trace back the same sequence by turning it backwards. So in a way, heritage languages will give us the replay of acquisition trajectory. The first in, last out is certainly just a hypothesis. And so it's important not only to take it for granted, but to test it. And that's what we've been doing a lot with heritage languages. If you look at heritage speakers, let's say in the United States, where there are a lot of immigrants and a lot of heritage languages, we find that there is tremendous variation across those speakers. There are some speakers who are very good, and they can even maybe pass for a native speaker for a little while. And there are some speakers who can barely say, "I love you, Grandma," and "I need $20," which is essentially what they use the heritage language for. So those speakers are probably particularly interesting for us. And in my lab, we mostly study the comprehension of those heritage speakers who are very, very weak. Sometimes these people are called overhearers, which means that as they were growing up, they overheard the language and they were exposed to it to a certain degree, but they can't really produce it. So the question is how much they understand. And again, when you address this question, it depends very much on who you ask. If you ask the parents of these people, they'll say, oh, my kid understands everything. If you ask these people, they'll say, well, I may understand something. And so the truth is, as usual, in the middle, because they do understand a certain number of things. But the impression or the illusion that they understand a lot comes from the fact that they're often in such pragmatic situations where it's clear what's going on. Because, you know, if you need the car keys, there are not too many ambiguities. If you need to say, I love you, Grandma, it's unlikely that you'll say something different. But if you put them in a situation where they have to distinguish between ambiguous sequences, or where they have to choose between things which look very similar, it's really hard for them. And this is where their vulnerabilities come through. So far I've described the general kind of picture of heritage language, and I've identified two reasons why these languages are so important. Because on the one hand, they allow us to see the structural underpinnings of natural language. And on the other hand, they allow us to test the first in, last out hypothesis, retracing the steps of child language acquisition. So let's take a look at some instances of heritage languages as spoken in the United States, which is the area where we do a lot of work. We have very large pockets of heritage speakers of Cantonese, Korean, Russian, Hindi, and Spanish. And so these are the main groups that we've been studying in my lab. What we do is we try to study large groups of people, because this immediately allows us to put a handle on variation across heritage speakers. We tend to ask for people who can't read, and we try to select those heritage speakers who are not really interested in relearning their language. You'll be surprised how many people of that sort you find. However, there are also some heritage speakers who grow up with very little interest or even rejection of their home language, but when they go to college, they suddenly decide, oh, I want to learn it. Like, why would I go learn German, whereas, you know, I can go and study Korean, which I learned as a child. They typically go to those classes because they expect that they're going to get an easy A in the class, and they very quickly discovered that they won't get an easy A, but instead it's really hard for them to read. And it's really, really hard for them to be next to someone who's studying Korean as their second language, because they've never been exposed to Korean in a classroom setting. So what we see in those speakers is a set of three main factors. One is that they retain some of the features which are typical of child language, because this is where they're interrupted in their acquisition. So you see a 20-year-old heritage speaker who will be using some baby words. They will say something like, my tummy hurts, or they will call someone who they would be supposed to be calling politely with some child words. And this is a phenomenon which we know from fossilization of child language. The fact that certain features are fossilized more than others tells us that there are some features in language which are harder to learn than others. Just to give you an example, verbs are generally easier to learn than nouns. And despite the fact that children start speaking with nouns, we do see more mistakes in nominal morphology than we see in the verbal morphology, regardless of the baseline language. Even if your language has very complicated verbal morphology and the nominal morphology is not very difficult, the heritage speakers stumble upon nominal morphology more so. So the first component then is this fossilization of particular childhood features. We have a project which we just started where we started looking at heritage English. And it's very interesting because you think of English as this invincible language which conquers the world and nobody can lose it. But if you think about communities where there are large numbers of expatriates who have children, this is where you see possibilities for heritage English. So we have 3 projects running, one in Israel, one in France, and one in Japan. In all 3 countries, you have large expat communities, and the kids in those communities are more dominant in Hebrew, French, or Japanese. So if we look at their English, we start saying that they show the same heritage features that we saw, for example, in heritage Korean or heritage Russian as spoken in Boston. And these kids do exactly the same things as young children learning English do. So, for example, they double the past tense morphology. So if you take the verb to dress, the regular past tense is dressed, and a lot of them will say dressed, or talk, talked, talked, went, wented, and so on. So this is a very typical feature. So I'm still talking about the fossilization of child language. Another feature or another factor which shapes heritage grammars for us is the obvious transfer from the dominant language that these people speak. So let's say we have people who are heritage speakers of English and who live in France or in Israel. In those languages, French and Hebrew, we normally put adverbs right after the verb. So you have things like, I read often this newspaper, and this is what they transfer into their English. And then finally, the third feature, which is particularly interesting, is the feature which has to do with the development of universal properties of natural language. And that's what we're after. We're trying to see what it is that all these heritage languages will share, which will make them more alike and less different from each other. To wrap it all up, we've been talking about different properties of these languages, and like I said, this is a new field. So there have been two main directions of inquiry. One is collecting empirical data on these languages, and the other is identifying general theoretical questions. The second component has led to this development that I mentioned, looking at fossilization of child language, interference from the dominant language, and universal properties. The next steps have to do with more experimental work on these languages, because we now have a fairly good idea as to what exactly can go wrong and what exactly is pretty robust. So we need to find more empirical data on that. And then, of course, the next step is to explain what goes on. Why is it that people universally keep more verbs than they keep nouns? What is it about the nature of nouns as opposed to the nature of verbs that makes them more vulnerable? So hopefully in a couple of years we will know what exactly it is that drives the existing fine-grained differences in those heritage languages.
So what I'm going to talk about today is really the question of whether animal and human communication systems are the same kind of thing or different kinds of things. This is a really old question. It goes back well before Darwin, but Darwin really crystallized it. So in The Origin of the Species, he has a discussion where he's asking the question of, do we humans just have more of what animals already have? So, you know, dogs bark and monkeys squeal, and do we just do that, except we just do it more because we're cleverer? And there's an alternative idea, which is, no, we're just different. So the way we're set up is different. It's not that we've got more intellectual oomph than other animals, which we do probably, but it's just that we're also set up quite differently. So this is the question I want to talk about. And there's some really interesting evidence, I think anyway, that leads us down the second line. That is that we're set up differently. It's not so much that we are just cleverer. There's something about us that makes us different as far as language goes. So, I mean, this idea that we're set up differently has kind of gone through cycles in the science of linguistics over time. So there was a period, if we think about sounds, for example, there was a period back in the 50s and 60s where people discovered that human beings have this capacity to take streams of sound and to cut them into discrete bits. Right, so when I say the difference between, say, a ta and a da, the big difference between those two sounds is not where they're made in the mouth, but actually the fact that my voice box switches on and starts buzzing a bit earlier in da than in ta. Okay, there's other things going on as well in English, but that's the big difference. That's the main difference, and that's called the onset of voicing. So it used to be thought, when this was sort of discovered, it was discovered that even little babies could detect the onset of voicing difference, and they made a sharp split between the d sound and the t sound. And the way they tested this is what they did was they used speech synthesizers. This was back in the 50s and 60s. They used speech synthesizers and they just changed incrementally when the onset of the voice starts. So, they'd essentially say, they'd play ta, and then they'd move the voicing a bit further into the sound, so it would sound a bit more like da, and then it'd be very into the sound, so it'd be like da, right? And they did that like in tiny, tiny incremental bits. And what they found with the babies is that even really young babies, they just make a sharp split. They hear it as ta, then they hear it as da. And that's how all human languages work. So everyone was like, wow, like humans, we're so special. And then there was a famous experiment done by Kuhl and Miller, and they showed that actually we're not that special. Chinchillas can do this. So what they did was they trained chinchillas, and they trained them, first of all, to recognize the clear difference between d and t. Okay. Then they did the same kind of experiment. They incremented with the speech synthesizer. They incremented where the voice starts. And they wanted to see whether the chinchillas would notice a sharp difference, or if they would just sort of see it was just like a statistical thing, right? And they did it in quite a horrible way. They'd play duh, duh, duh to the chinchillas. And then first of all, what they do is they make the chinchillas really thirsty. They put water over the end of the cage. And then they'd say da, 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 and the chinchillas would run over and get the water and be very happy. But sometimes they would say ta, and the chinchillas would start off going, and then they would electrocute the chinchillas' feet. Which is pretty horrible, right? But what it did was it made the chinchillas recognize that if they hear ta, they're not going to run over. And if they hear da, they are. So they taught them that, and then they did this thing with the speech synthesizer, and they just incrementally moved things forward a little bit, and they discovered that chinchillas, just like babies, they make a sharp distinction. So we thought way back in the 50s that maybe we discovered something special about humans, this idea that humans make a categorical language split between sounds, a big, two different categories, a t versus a d, a p versus a b, a k versus a g, and so on. But actually it turns out that chinchillas can do it, rats can do it, monkeys can do it, lizards can do it, snakes can do it. Virtually everyone can do this. So it's not remotely a special human. So you might think Darwin was right then, right? So it is just that we use this in a kind of more clever way than other animals, but other animals can do it too. So that was one big thing that looked like, it's kind of one goal for the Darwin side. So there's other cases that Darwin picked up on where animals also seem to have a capacity to use not so much sounds like we do, but words. So if you think about, you say to your dog or whatever, sit, run, and the dog can learn a few English words or Russian words or whatever language. And there's a very famous case where basically dogs, there's a dog called Rico, who's a border collie, and they taught him hundreds of words that he could learn. And you might think, so maybe it is just that we as humans, we have the same capacity as a dog or a monkey or something like that to learn distinct words, but actually what happens is we just have more oomph there. And it's certainly the case that we have more oomph, because human babies learn hundreds of words a day, well, not hundreds a day, 10 a day, hundreds a month. We learn about 10,000 words over a lifetime, and animals never really get more than a couple of hundred. So there's some big difference there. So that's another thing where you might think, maybe Darwin was right here. Darwin's a clever guy, so maybe he was right. But I think the big blow that shows that he wasn't right is not in sounds and not really in words, but it's really in grammar. It's in the capacity to put words together and create meaningful sentences out of them. So we do this all the time. I'm doing it right now. I'm saying quite complex things. I'm getting over quite complex ideas to you, and I'm doing it effortlessly. Well, maybe it's not so effortless, but it's very easy for me to put all these words together and to say what I mean. No other animal is anywhere near that. So there was some debate in the 60s and 70s and early 80s with apes, which are our closest relatives genetically. So Kanzi, who's a very famous ape, who's a bonobo, there was a lot of claims made for Kanzi, who was worked with by a woman called Susan Savage-Rumbaugh, and she argued that Kanzi could actually put words together and create new meanings out of the words that he put together. Generally, people don't think that that's true anymore, and part of the reason they don't think it's true is because actually what Savage-Rumbaugh did was quite clever. She got Kanzi to do some stuff. She would use these things called lexicograms, which are like words, and she would get Kanzi to understand the lexicograms in sequences and go and do stuff with them, you know, put a ball in a basin or whatever. And she'd go like, look, well, that's amazing. I can show Kenzie these lexicograms and he can put the ball in the basin. And she got a young child, Aaliyah, I think she was called at the time, and Aaliyah could do the same kind of thing. And so Savage Rumble said, well, look, Kenzie's got like the grammatical skills of a 3-year-old child. But actually, there's a linguist called Rob Truswell at Edinburgh, and he's looked very carefully at all of the data that Savage Rumbaugh put together. And he's taken out examples where he's coordinated two things. So he'll say something like, you know, put the ball and the orange in the cup, or something like that, right? And Kenzie, the bonobo, just doesn't know what to do, right? Doesn't understand that ball and orange is a single chunk, is a single grammatical unit, and that's what's to be put in the cup. So sometimes Kenzie will put the orange in, sometimes the ball, sometimes just wander away and do nothing. Aaliyah, at the same time, the 3-year-old kid, she gets it right virtually all the time. So it looks like Aaliyah has actually quite a different linguistic capacity from Kenzie. What it looks like Kenzie's really doing is he's attending to the sequence of things, and he's understood the sequence matters, but because of these examples where you're sticking two things together in the sequence, you're saying put the ball and the orange in the cup, where the ball and the orange is a single grammatical unit. Kenzie can't understand that. He can't understand that there's a hierarchy to the sentence. He only sees the sequence. Now Aaliyah, who's the human child, she's 3 years old, but she gets the fact that the language is organized like a hierarchy straight off. So that's really quite interesting, because that shows that Kenzie, who's clearly very clever, he's as clever as a 3-year-old child in many, many other respects. And he's got a real incredible proficiency with language, right? He's learned hundreds, like 500, I think it is, of these signs for things, these lexicograms, and he's able to understand sequences, but he just can't get the hierarchy. And the hierarchy is what's at the heart of human language. The hierarchy is the thing that allows us to create meanings in kind of almost unbounded ways. So we can put elements together, and then we create a single chunk. We can put that together with something else, create a larger chunk, and then we can do just what I'm doing right now, which is just speaking and speaking and speaking. And probably I'm speaking too long now, right? And animals, we've not found a single animal that can do anything like that. There's another really interesting case where actually it looks that like animals can do stuff with language, but they can do things with language in a quite different way than humans can. So this is the case. It's work by Juan Toro, who's in Barcelona, and he compares rats, who you might not think are the most linguistic of creatures, and babies. And he shows that rats are better at certain linguistic tasks than babies are, better than human babies. So the particular task is actually trying to see whether rats can learn a specific rule of a sequence of syllables. So what he does is he looks at examples like dagare, numuze, luguba, right? Where if you think about those, you've got the same vowel, and then a different vowel, right? So the rat or the child can essentially be exposed to lots of cases like that, and then we'll learn the actual difference, right? We'll go like, oh, so when the rat or the child hears a different pattern, we'll go, oh, what was that, right? So rats can do that, kids can do that. But what kids can't do is do something when you've got the same consonants, if you've got a pattern of the consonants. So for example, if you had something like da, do, na, or ge, go, re, or li, lo, ma, or something like that, where you've got the same consonant, then a different consonant, kids just break. They just can't do it. The rats, however, can learn the rule. So it turns out that you might think, oh my God, rats are actually better at language than babies are in some case. So that's kind of like Darwin was not right. What was going on here? But actually it's really interesting, because if you look at human languages, we know of many human languages that create rules by messing around with the vowel sounds. So the Semitic languages work like this: Hebrew, Arabic, Tigrinya, and so on. What they do is they change the tense of verbs, or they turn verbs into nouns by changing the vowel patterns, but not by changing the consonant patterns. We don't know of any language that's like the inverse of Hebrew, that where you would change the consonant patterns and the vowels would be the word, and you mess around with the consonant patterns to make it past tense or future tense. And it seems that in some weird and interesting way, we human beings have a limited capacity to do certain things with the structures of language. And that limited capacity we have is not just looking at statistical patterns, it's something very special to us. And that's something that we can see actually happening in the languages we speak, which I think means that Darwin in the end was wrong. That is, humans have something that's just quite different from what animals have. It's not that we're more clever, it's just that we're differently clever. A few years ago, there was a very weird incident that happened. A bunch of people from Facebook had started to get, you know, these little chatbots? There's these chatbots where you can talk to each other, right? So they developed a couple of chatbots, and then they got them to talk to each other. And then the chatbots started to develop the way that they were talking to each other, and it began to look really, really strange. It started off with English, well, it had English words, but actually then the grammar of it all changed and the chatbots were not really using English sentences. And at some point, the developers, the researchers in Facebook were like, oh, what is this? This doesn't look anything like English. But interestingly enough, the chatbots were still doing what the researchers wanted them to do. So what the researchers wanted them to do was to negotiate. So they were really interested in seeing if they could get a system where a chatbot would be able to negotiate with a human, right? So the way they wanted to do this was they essentially got loads and loads of humans to negotiate with each other about something silly like, you know, I want 3 balls and you want 2 boxes, and they have to kind of figure out a way of satisfying each other's needs through a conversation. And then they recorded all of those, and then they fed that data into the chatbots, and then they got the chatbots then to start talking to each other. And the plan for the chatbots was win the negotiation, get the best negotiation, right? And as I said, what happened is the chatbots went a bit crazy, and the researchers were like, that doesn't really look very much like English at all. And so they turned off the program. Now, it was kind of amusing in the press at the time because what happened was the press went crazy. You can imagine, oh my God, these AIs, they're going to like take over the world. They're creating their own language and stuff like that. That wasn't really what was happening. It sort of was what was happening. They were creating their own way of communicating. But it wasn't so much the researchers were worried that the chatbots were going to take over the world. It was that, you know, they hadn't really asked the chatbots to keep to English. They'd asked them to win the negotiating strategy. And then they redid this and they got the chatbots to kind of speak more like English again, right? But it was a very interesting experiment because it raised 2 interesting questions. One of which is, what would happen if AIs became so good at language that they could just communicate with each other using language? And would that leave us behind? In some sense, would they just get so good at it, they would just leave us behind? So that's the question I want to address. I mean, can it be the case that the AIs, artificial intelligences like Alexa or Siri or whatever, can they be as good at language as we are? And moreover, will they do it in the same way as we do? Will they be using language like human beings are using language? And the answer I'm going to give is they could get pretty damned good at it. They could get really as good at it as us or better or whatever that means. But they would be doing it in quite a different way. So if we look back at the history of how artificial intelligences have dealt with language, if we look back to the 70s, which is when this really started to happen, AI engineers were really interested in whether they could get AIs to talk to human beings, like the computer on Star Trek or whatever. And so people started building systems. And the most famous one had the really weird name of Sherdloo. And it was a system that was built by Terry Winograd. And it was just a very simple system where you had a world. The world consisted of blocks, colored blocks of different sizes. And the program knew the world, and then you could interact with the program, and you could say to it something like, put the blue block on the red block, or whatever. And then the system would say, I have put the blue block on the red block. And it would work like that. And to make that system work, what Winograd did was he took everything he knew about the grammar of English and turned it into sort of computerized rules. And then he connected those rules with the meaning of the various words and the meanings of the way the words were put together in this little world of blocks and stuff. And then he used that to build this program. It was quite an incredible piece of work, actually. And you could get the program to do stuff. It was a bit like Star Trek, but it was just this world of blocks. That's not really very helpful, right? I mean, blocks is not great. So the question was, could you take something like Sherdlu and expand that and make it completely general, make it work like a human being works, right? So that's what people tried. People tried that all through the 70s and 80s, and it's really difficult. It's really difficult because you never know what human beings are about to talk about. Human beings talk about all sorts of stuff, and they talk about things that are not present in front of them. They talk about things that are in their imaginations. And, you know, I mean, to get a computer program to do that, it's just incredibly difficult. So what people did during the 70s and 80s was they attempted to get the grammar better. Bigger sets of rules, connected to bigger domains. And in fact, they started to, they computerized that effect as well. So they would get loads and loads of text, and they get hundreds of graduate students in linguistics to analyze all the texts, and then they'd get a computer program to trawl through all the text and extract the rules, and then they use those rules to build another computer program to try and understand the language. And that's basically what people did in the 80s. People are still doing it, and these gigantic collections of sentences, analyzed sentences, are called tree banks, and they're still very, very useful. But it never really worked because of this same problem. You never know what people are going to talk about. Things just break, basically. These systems are very fragile. And so they don't work like humans work. Or they're not as flexible as we humans are. So something happened in the 80s, though, that has created a new artificial intelligence that does things in a very different way, and that's what surrounds us right now. If we look at Alexa or Siri or Hey Google or whatever, they're all using this new system. And it's a system that works in a very different way. What you don't do is you don't try and work out what the rules are in these systems. What you do is you get the system to be very, very general and very good at analyzing whatever you throw at it. And these systems are called neural nets. And essentially what you do is you feed the system some data and you tell it what output you want, right? And then you just let it go. And it just churns and churns and churns and churns, trying to match the data it's got to the output that you want effectively, okay? And once it's churned a lot, you've got a new system. You've got a system that's sort of structured in a way that will give you the output that you want for the data that you give it. And that's how most AI systems work these days. And they're really quite brilliant. So if you look at, if you say to something like an AI like Siri, and you say, oh, Siri, play me Rachmaninoff, then Siri will probably play you some Rachmaninoff, right? Or Alexa or whatever. So, and they do that essentially by using these neural net systems. It's quite interesting because what they really do, it's not very much like a human being at all. I mean, what we do when I say play Rachmaninoff is it goes into your brain and you just work out what it means and you go and get a Rachmaninoff record or something. What these systems do is they hear what you're saying, they parse it statistically using these neural nets, and they do that by sending it off across the internet using to Apple or Google servers in Ireland or in California or wherever they are, and then they get all of that data and then they spit it back to you. So it's like a global intelligence, really, which is quite fascinating. So they manage all that sound, and that works really well. But then they got to manage the grammar. They've got to figure out what you mean by saying, Siri, play me some Rachmaninoff, and they're pretty bad at that. All they essentially do is they kind of just make a good guess by looking at what is most probable for what those words mean, right? So the kind of task that you have, looking across the whole of the internet, what's the most probable likelihood that those tasks will mean play Rachmaninoff or something, okay? All you're doing is just taking the various words and putting them together. It's like you've got a soup of the words, you're stirring them all around and you're just making the best guess. That's like the semantic soup strategy, it's called sometimes. You're using keywords. So that's not how humans do it, right? But there's been new systems. So I don't know if you, so just quite recently, a couple of years back, Google started to use a different approach, and it was using it mainly in Google Translate, but it's now being used everywhere. And what that approach does is it doesn't just use keywords to work out what's going on. What it does is it uses not just the likelihood of what's going to happen when you've got a bunch of words together, but actually which word is most likely to follow or precede the next word. So if I say to you something like, the cat sat on the, you're probably going to say mat because you've heard that 1,000 times. But if I say the cat sat on the cloud, that's a bit more unusual. If I say the cat sat on the independence, that's really unusual. And if I say the cat sat on the, you're like, what? Right? These are all sentences of English. You can work out what they might mean. You can imagine for the last one, there's a big book and it's got words in it, and the cat sat on the, right? Perfectly reasonable. But the cat sat on the is really rare. It's not going to happen very much. Whereas the cat sat on the mat, the word mat after the is really common, right? So you can use how commonly certain words follow other words to make a good guess as to what the grammar of the sentence is going to be. And that's what these new systems do. So if you notice Google Translate getting better in the last few years, it's because it started to pay attention to this particular idea that you can look at the statistical likelihood of one word following another. Now there's really sophisticated versions of this now. They're called long-term, short-term memory neural nets. And what they do is they kind of keep a memory of what they've already heard as well. Right? So in my example, the cat sat on the mat, they'll remember cat and they'll think that mats are pretty likely places for cats to be. So essentially what happens is that they've got sort of memory, and you can use that essentially to make the grammar work. So let's take an example like the foxes in my greenhouse are jumping around. If you think about foxes and then are quite far away from each other, right? The foxes in my greenhouse are. But the noun that's right next to are is greenhouse. And you don't say the foxes in my greenhouse is, you say are, because it's foxes you're talking about, not greenhouses, right? And that's always been really difficult for these neural nets, but these new sophisticated ones, they can get that. They can figure out what the most likely verb to agree with the noun is and so on. Okay, I'm going to finish by just saying, wow, that looks incredible. But it turns out that actually these neural nets don't do this in the same way that we do. So people have done experiments. There's a researcher called Tal Linson who's done experiments on these sophisticated neural nets, treating them as though they're humans and getting them to sort of do tasks with language. And at the same time, you get humans to do the tasks with language. And both the nets and the humans make mistakes. But the mistakes that the nets make, the neural nets make, are really quite different from the mistakes that the humans make. So even though their performance and their outward behavior is very, very similar, actually what's going on deep down for both of them is quite different. So it turns out that even though neural nets, the kind of AIs we have just now, can be absolutely brilliant at language, what they're doing is something quite different from what we human beings are doing with language.
To look into the question of language design, it's useful to think of how human beings evolved. We don't know a great deal about it, but we know some things. So, for example, it's fairly clear from the archaeological record that modern humans, modern Homo sapiens, cognitively modern Homo sapiens, developed quite recently in evolutionary time, and maybe within the last roughly 100,000 years, which is a flick of an eye. That's when you get the enormous explosion of indications of creative activity, complex family structures, symbolism, and so on. All of this develops roughly in that period. And interestingly, there has been no detectable evolution of these capacities in roughly the past 50,000 years. That's the period since our ancestors left Africa, a small number of them, and pretty quickly spread over the world. So all humans are pretty much identical with regard to cognitive capacity, linguistic capacity, and so on, which means that there's been essentially no detectable evolution. So there's a small window there where something happened, and it's generally assumed by paleoanthropologists, people who study these topics, that it must have been the emergence of language, because it's hard to imagine any of these basically creative activities without language, and the language does provide the mechanisms for them. So it seems as though the core of human sensibility and creative and cognitive capacity is the development of this completely unique capacity. There's nothing analogous to it anywhere in the animal world. There are animal signaling systems, but they're completely different in design and use and just about every dimension. So something strange happened roughly maybe 100,000 years ago, not very long, and language emerged in humans. And the question then is, well, what kind of a system is it? On the surface, languages look very different from one another. So if somebody walks into the room and starts speaking Swahili, I'm not going to understand a word, though I will recognize that it's a language. I won't understand it, but I know it's not noise. You know. As soon as you look more deeply, you find that these languages are basically molded to a pretty similar design, maybe an identical design. The large parts of the what we hear is just the sounds, but that's a very superficial part of language. The core of language is principles that determine actually an infinite array of possible expressions, structured expressions, which have definite meanings. Now, all of that is well beyond what we can just observe by, say, looking at texts. And when a child is learning a language, the child doesn't learn those things. There's no evidence for them, almost no evidence for them. Nobody can teach them. We don't even know what they are. These are just part of our nature. The core principles, so-called syntactic principles, that form expressions and that provide specific interpretations for them, that's apparently just all part of our nature. And then there are various ways of externalizing it in sound or in sign, which is about the same. But that's a kind of a superficial manifestation of an internal uniformity. And the really exciting, and it almost has to be this way, if you think about the way the system developed. It apparently developed very suddenly in evolutionary terms, which meant that there were very limited selectional pressures. So it probably was designed as a computational, it is a computational system. It's the only explanation for this array of capacities. Computational systems have certain optimal characteristics. Some are more efficient than others. And there's every reason to believe that this developed pretty suddenly as an optimal communication system, essentially following laws of nature, very much the way a snowflake assumes a very complex form, and not because of experience or training, but just because that's the way the laws of physics work. And there's every reason to believe that language is something like this. Now, to try to show it is no trivial matter. You have to try to show that the superficial variety of languages actually reduces to principles of a common character which approach notions of optimal design. And there has been, I think, notable progress in that process. There's a long way to go to try to demonstrate it. And of course, then one wants to go beyond, to try maybe ultimately to discover the neural basis for whatever this unique capacity is. And that's a very hard problem to study for humans. So we know a lot about the human visual system because of direct experimentation with cats and monkeys. We allow ourselves to do direct experimentation, sticking electrodes into the brain and so on, controlled experiments, but we don't do it with humans. And humans have about the same visual system as cats and monkeys, so we know about the human visual system. But you can't do that for language. There are no analogous systems. So you can't, there's not much use studying other animals. We're unique in this respect. And invasive experiments with human beings are, of course, barred. So it's a very complex and intricate matter to try to find clever ways of getting around the barriers to learn something about these topics. And some progress is being made. I think we can look forward to a period when there will be convergence of various modes of inquiry into design of language, neural basis, acquisition, possible varieties of language, and so on. That's a crucial task for the future, which in fact is directed to the core of human nature, the core of cognitive human nature. The most intriguing question, I think, is the one that I basically just mentioned. There's reason to believe that the core of human intellectual nature, cognitive nature, is a computational system which probably has something like the properties of a snowflake. It simply had to develop this way, given biological and physical law and special circumstances. And the most intriguing question is to try to see if that's true, and if it is, to show that it's true.
Of the many languages that have ever been spoken, only a few of them have been able to achieve global provenance, or they have been important enough to be considered a global language. And a lot of people have tried to look at what languages are global in the past, and they have used different measures, whether a language is spoken by a large number of people, or whether the people that speak that language have a large military, or whether the people that speak that language have a high level of income. And these measures, in some sense, give us an idea of which languages are more important than others, but they leave out an important dimension that help us understand the truly global importance of a language, which is the ability of a language to connect people from other languages, not only from that language. So for example, I speak Spanish and I speak English, and I can learn something from my Spanish friends and then transmit it to my English friends. And basically this multilingualism is what allows information to flow from one language group or from one part of the world that is subject to one culture to other parts of the world that basically are subject to different culture. The thing is, although this is an observation that is rather obvious, it has been so far historically impossible to measure the network of global languages, and therefore use that information to help determine which are the languages that are more important. So what we have done in my group is we have gone to the web and gone to different repositories of data, and we have been able to collect information that allow us to map languages that are co-spoken with others. So we use 3 different data sources. The first one, we use Twitter dataset, and we look at 1 billion tweets. And when we look at 1 billion tweets, we can say, well, do you express yourself in Russian in Twitter, and do you express yourself in English in Twitter? And we can detect the language of your tweet, and if we know that you express yourself in both languages, we know that you contribute a little bit to the link between Russian speakers and English speakers. But since you don't express yourself, let's say in Vietnamese, you do not contribute a link between Russian and Vietnamese. So that allows us to construct one version of the global language network that is particular to the subset of people that use Twitter. Then we went to Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is a very nice resource because it's available in many different languages. And we can look at people that edited Wikipedia in one language and in another language. So for example, a person that edited Wikipedia in German and also edited the French edition of the Wikipedia would be a person that speaks both German and French. So that gives us another measure of this global language network. And finally, we collected a set of 2.2 million book translations that was made available by UNESCO, and that tells us if a book was translated, let's say, from English to Spanish or from Spanish to Catalan. And in that case, the translations that we look at are the translations that actually happen, not necessarily the ones from the language in which the book was written to the final language in which the book was expressed. So for example, a version of Tom Sawyer that was translated from Spanish to Catalan would count as a link from Spanish to Catalan, and not from English, which is the original language in which Mark Twain wrote Tom Sawyer, to Catalan. So now that we have these three networks, we have the Twitter, Wikipedia, and book translation network, what we started doing is we started first, looking at whether these three networks were similar. After all, each one of these three networks represents three different groups of people. Twitter people, are people that are very much, online, maybe through mobile devices. Wikipedia people, the ones that edit pages there, are people that are very much knowledge specialists, that also have a big drive for contributing to public online resources. And book translators, are a very different group of people themselves. And what we find is that actually the three networks are quite similar. So that tells us that probably what we're capturing in the structure of this network is something that is universal to the world. What we find also in these networks is that these networks are highly hierarchical, and all of them are organized as English with the main hub. So English is the central hub in all of these networks, and then there's a few, 5 or 10, peripheral hub languages, and then all of the rest of the other languages are extremely peripheral in this network. So what this means is that for a communication to go from one peripheral language, let's say Kazakh, to another peripheral language, Mapudungun, it will have to go from Kazakh to Russian, from Russian to English, from English to Spanish, and from Spanish to Mapudungun. We have to go up into more connected languages and then down to less connected languages. So there's a very hierarchical structure. And that hierarchical structure is such that if we take these networks and we start removing a few of these highly connected nodes, a few of these hub languages, we find that the network will quickly fall apart. So in most cases, actually, if we remove only 5 or 6 languages, it would be enough for the network to be almost completely disconnected. And that would mean that basically there's only 5 or 6 languages that are keeping the whole communication of the world, interconnected. So we were able to create these measures, and we're able to see that actually the centrality or the position of a language in the network matters. Is the one that enables the flow of information apparently, and is the one that determines the ability of other languages to communicate. But are there other ways in which we can eventually validate the centrality of a language in a language group network? And actually there is. So we validated the position of a language in the global language network as a measure of that language's importance by looking at 2 different data sets. The first data set is a data set in which we took every biography of people that have presence in at least 25 language editions of the Wikipedia. So let's take someone like Elvis Presley. So does he have a presence in the English Wikipedia and in the French Wikipedia and the German Wikipedia? The answer would be yes, yes, yes. And actually who have presence in tens or maybe hundreds of Wikipedias. So that gives us an idea that, well, he's a very prominent character, and we know that he was born in the United States. So therefore, we would attribute him to the English language group. So we look at all people that have presence in at least 25 languages in the Wikipedia, and we created a data set, and connected each one of them to the language of the cities in which they were born. And when we look at the correlation between the number of illustrious people born to a language and the centrality of the language in the group, the language group network, we find that actually, that correlation is significantly strong after we control for income and population. So basically, being born into a highly connected language, it's a better predictor of whether that person is going to be important or not than being born into a language that is very populous or that is spoken by people that are very wealthy. We use alternatively another data set that was published by Charles Murray in a book a few years ago, in which he created a list of 4,000 illustrious people in the arts and sciences, and we basically find the same results, that the centrality of a language in the global language network is significantly a strong predictor of whether that language produces a large number of illustrious people after controlling for the income and the population of the language. Surprisingly, we find that, for example, Chinese, Hindi, and Arabic are not hub languages, although they're highly popular. There's a lot of people that speak them, and actually, in some of the cases, the GDP, the total GDP associated to those languages is quite large, but they're peripheral in the global language network. So basically, what we have been able to find in that research project is that, it is possible to quantify the importance of a language by looking at something other than the attributes of its speakers, but by looking at how that language helps connect people that speak other languages, how those languages intermediate the global flow of communication. And there are important implications of that type of research. Certainly, the importance of a language can help people become informed about which languages they should learn, and what are the languages that they should be expressing their content in. Also, it shows that there's quite an important degree of responsibility for the speakers of those hub languages. So you can imagine now that an information that goes from one peripheral language to another and has to go through hub languages, is going to get distorted, by being translated through those hub languages. People that speak that hub language have some certain degree of responsibility because through their culture, is how other cultures learn from each other. So think about the way that a person that speaks Mapudungun in south central Chile will learn about the Arab-Israeli conflict. Certainly, there's probably no news sources that translate directly from Arab or Hebrew to Mapudungun. Therefore, the information is going to have to go probably, from Arab to English, from English to Spanish, and from Spanish to Mapudungun. That set of translations, it is very likely that even if there's no intention or bias from the translators, the story is going to get somehow distorted. There's going to be a little bit of noise. So eventually, these languages that are highly connected, these hub languages, are going to help shape the discourse and are going to help shape how distant cultures see each other. Not because they have any bias or any intention to change the way that they would see each other, but because by being the ones that are responsible for translation, they're going to certainly incorporate their ideas and their views into the process. So I think one important question that you can explore from this approach is the question of language survival and where our global language is going to be in the future. So there's a lot of back and forth in the press about the role of English or the role of Chinese, since Chinese is a highly spoken language, and whether Chinese is going to trump English in the future. From our perspective, when we look at the connectivity in English, we realize that actually English is a language that is supported as a global language not because of its sheer number of speakers, but because of its ability to connect the speakers of other languages. And that's a property that Chinese is lacking, despite being a language that is highly popular because of the large Chinese population. So this starts telling us that the way that language probably going to evolve, or if there's going to be a meta language that is going to emerge in the future, probably the contributions to that meta language are going to depend on how connected those languages are right now, and not necessarily on the number of speakers. So it matters how connected the language is and not how many people actually speak them. So the question is whether the use of the data sources that we have employed to measure the global language network affects our results, and certainly they do. So certainly the results that we obtain are contingent to the data that we're looking into. But in some sense, there are important remarks that we need to make in order to understand that context. First, you might say, well, Twitter, and Wikipedia were born, into English media. And they're part of the internet, and in the internet, more than 50% of the languages that are being spoken in the internet are English. Basically, the internet is more than half an English media. Is that a bias, or is that a reflection of our times? Because if Arabic would be so important, maybe there would be a big portion of the internet that would be in Arabic. But if that portion is relatively small, and if that portion tends to not connect to many other languages, it probably indicates that in our times, English has become the dominant language in the dominant form of communication technology that nowadays is the web and all of the different type of web services that we use. In the case of the book translation network, we do see Russian, for example, to be a secondary hub of quite some importance, connecting to a lot of languages that were part of the former Soviet Union and of other communist countries. So, for example, Russia connects, in book translations, to Kazakh or to Tajik or to Lao or to Vietnamese, which are actually languages that obtain a lot of their literature during, last century, from Russian. Nowadays, however, those type of translation efforts have stopped. They're not as prevalent as they were before. And now that people access information through the web, also, you're seeing that those languages are more connected in that sense, to English than to Russian as they were in the past. So certainly, there is the results that are contingent, to the data sets that we have used. But my question is, we didn't go and choose exactly those data sets because they were, the ones that would give us English, but because the ones that were available. And the fact that there are no too many other data sets available for the other languages tells us something about the prominence of those other languages.